The morning Mara Whitcomb's stepfather threw her out, he didn't even bother to stand up from his chair. He just pointed at the door. "You've got until I finish this coffee," Harold Briggs said, not looking at her, stirring his cup with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who had already decided this moment cost him nothing. "After that, whatever you leave behind stays behind." Mara's mother stood at the kitchen window with her back turned. Her shoulders were rigid. Her hands gripped the edge of the sink, like she was afraid the floor might tilt. She said nothing. That silence, that particular, terrible silence, was the thing Mara would carry longest. Not Harold's words, not the cold morning air when she stepped off the porch, with everything she owned in a canvas pack, not the $2 silver she'd been saving since she was 16, wrapped in a scrap of wool at the very bottom of the bag. Not even the hunger that would find her before sundown. It was her mother's hands on that sink, white-knuckled, chosen. If you've ever been told without a single word that you are not worth the trouble of being defended, then you already understand everything important about who Mara Whitcombe was at 20 years old and why what she did next changed the rest of her life. Before we go any further, if you're new here, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button if you've ever had to start over with almost nothing. And drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Mara. She had known it was coming. Not the exact morning, not the exact words, but the shape of it, the slow withdrawal of whatever small tolerance Harold Briggs had extended toward his stepdaughter since the day he married her mother 4 years ago. It had been shrinking for months. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows any sign. Harold was not a violent man. That was almost the worst part of him. Violent men announced themselves. Harold worked through a kind of quiet, administrative cruelty, a comment at the dinner table, a look when she helped herself to a second portion, a sigh whenever she came home muddy from the Callaway stable where she'd been learning to shoe horses from old Dewey Callaway in exchange for mucking stalls 3 mornings a week. "You could at least try to look like you belong somewhere," he'd said once. Mara had been 19 then. She'd thought about a dozen things to say back. She'd said none of them. Her father, her real father, Thomas Whitcombe, dead of a fever when she was 13, had been a farrier and a practical man who believed information was the most useful thing you could put in a person's head. He'd spent her childhood teaching her things other fathers taught their sons. How to read soil, how to judge a horse's temperament from the way it moved its ears before you ever touched it, how to use a rasp, how to recognize when something was broken in a way you could fix versus broken in a way you had to work around. He'd never once looked at her the way Harold did. Mara walked 3 miles before she stopped to sit on a fallen log and eat the half loaf of cornbread she'd wrapped in cloth. That morning she'd done it before Harold woke up. Some part of her understanding the day was coming whether she was ready or not. She ate slowly. She drank from a creek. She checked her pack, canvas bag, wool blanket, her father's farrier rasp, which she'd hidden under the floorboards of the room she'd slept in since she was 16, because she didn't trust Harold not to sell it. A notebook 3/4 full of her father's handwriting, technical observations about horses, soil, weather, equipment repair, with the remaining quarter filled in her own hand over the last several years. A half bar of soap, a change of clothes, the $2 silver. She'd sat on that log for a long time. She was 20 years old, heavy-set in a way that the world apparently found amusing, with broad hands and a practical mind and absolutely nowhere to be. She was not the kind of girl who appeared in the stories women were supposed to want for themselves. She was not small or soft or particularly elegant. She sweated when she worked. She had opinions she'd been told were inconvenient. She ate without apology when she was hungry and then spent the next several hours being quietly ashamed of it, which was its own exhausting loop. The road west split at a crossroads 2 miles ahead. She'd been through this country once, 3 years ago, delivering a horse for Dewey Callaway to a buyer in a valley town called Briar Hollow. She remembered it as a small, practical place, a mill, a general store, a blacksmith's shop, a handful of farms, and the county land office tucked between the post and the feed merchant. She remembered something else. On the road into Briar Hollow, Dewey had pointed across a stretch of bottomland toward a ruined stone house sitting at the center of roughly 40 acres of overgrown field and neglected orchard. The gate had been falling off its post. The windows were dark holes. The chimney had partially collapsed. Ashwick Farm, Dewey had said. Nobody's touched it in about a decade. Old Lenora Ashwick died. Her children cleared out and never came back. County's been trying to offload it ever since. Mara had looked at it from the road for just a moment. Then Dewey clicked at the horse and they moved on, and she'd filed the information the way her father had taught her in the part of her mind reserved for things that might become useful later. She was beginning to think later might be now. She stood up, shouldered her pack, and walked west. It took her 2 days. The first night she slept under a pine overhang with her blanket pulled tight, listening to something move in the dark at the edge of the tree line. She didn't sleep much. She was cold, and her back hurt, and at some point in the early hours she allowed herself to be genuinely, thoroughly frightened, the kind of fear she'd been holding at arm's length since she stepped off that porch, and then she breathed through it and let it pass, and when the sky began to lighten, she got up, rolled her blanket, and kept walking. The second day was harder. She hadn't eaten since the cornbread. Her feet had blistered badly on the left heel. She stopped at a farmhouse around midday and offered to check the hooves on a farmer's draft horse in exchange for a meal, and the farmer, a heavy-set man named Wills, with suspicious eyes, looked her up and down and almost said no. She could see him deciding. "I know what I'm doing," she said. Not defensive, just factual. He let her look at the horse. The animal had a cracked hoof on the left rear that had been left too long. She cleaned it, packed it with pine tar from a can in the barn, explained what he'd need to watch for, and told him to keep the horse off hard ground for a week. Wills gave her cold cornbread and a wedge of hard cheese and didn't say much. But when she shouldered her pack and started back toward the road, he called after her. Briar Hollow's about 8 miles on. Road stays. She raised a hand without turning around. She reached Briar Hollow late the following morning, limping slightly, with 40 miles of walking behind her and hunger working steadily at her focus. The town was exactly as she remembered, practical, unglamorous, the kind of place that had been built for function and had never particularly bothered with anything beyond that. She found the county land office between the post and the feed merchant, exactly where she remembered it. The door stuck when she pushed it. The man behind the desk was perhaps 55. With a clerk's careful posture and the expression of someone who handled small transactions all day and expected this to be another one. He looked up when she came in. Then he looked at her more carefully, the canvas pack, the muddy boots, the blistered heel, visible through a split in the leather. "Help you," he said. "Ashwick Farm," Marcia said. 40 acres. Stone house, old orchard, east of the creek. I heard the county's been carrying it. The clerks straightened very slightly. "We have. It's been on the tax rolls 11 years. Nobody's moved on it." "You representing a buyer?" "I'm the buyer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, in the tone of a man who considers himself patient, he said, "Miss, that property needs substantial repair. The house is barely standing. The land hasn't been worked in over a decade. It's not suitable for—" "How much?" Mara said. He paused. $2, he said, "back taxes and transfer fee." Mara set her pack on the floor, reached into the wool at the bottom, and placed both silver dollars on the counter. The clerk looked at the coins, then at her, then at the coins again. "I'll need your name," he said finally. "Mara Whitcombe." He wrote it down with the slow precision of a man who wanted it, noted that he had done his job correctly, regardless of the outcome. He stamped the paper. He handed her a copy. He kept the coins. She picked up her pack and walked back out into the sharp spring air, holding a piece of paper that said she owned 40 acres and a ruin. She was penniless. She was 20 years old. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the land office, and several people passed her without a glance, and then a woman coming out of the feed merchant looked at her, really looked the way people did when they were calculating what category to put you in, and said to the man beside her, just loud enough to hear, "That's the Ashwick girl? Lord, she won't last a month." Mara didn't look at them. She already knew what people thought when they looked at her. She had snowed since she was 14 and grew out of the shape the world apparently preferred. She had been carrying that particular weight for 6 years, and it had never once made her less capable of anything she needed to do. She tucked the deed into her pack and started walking toward the creek. Ashwick Farm was worse than she remembered. The gate wasn't just falling, it was down entirely, half rotted into the ground. The stone house had kept its walls, which was something. But the roof was partially caved in over the back 2 rooms, and the front windows were empty holes that let the wind through with a moan she could hear from 20 feet away. The porch boards were soft. The chimney had lost its cap, and birds had nested inside it. The orchard, she could see it from the gate, was a tangle of unpruned trees, grown so wild they'd intertwined into something almost impenetrable, the branches crossing and recrossing until you couldn't tell one tree from another. The fields beyond were weeds shoulder high. She stood at the gate for a while. She had no food, no tools beyond her father's rasp, no money, no one who knew where she was or cared particularly whether she was found. She picked up the fallen gate, propped it against the stone pillar, and walked up the track to the front door. The door held. Barely the hinges had rusted to a state that was more suggestion than function, but it held. She pushed it open and stood in the entrance and let her eyes adjust. The great room was larger than she'd expected. The fireplace stone, massive, running almost the entire east's wall, was intact. The floor was stone flags, cracked in places, buried under years of dirt and leaves and debris that had blown in through the empty windows. The interior walls were plaster over stone, and while the plaster had cracked and fallen away in several places, the structure beneath was solid. She walked through each room. The 2 rooms under the collapsed section of roof were open to the sky. She stayed out of them. The rest of the house, 4 rooms total, plus a breezeway connecting to a small outbuilding that had once been a forge, was damaged but standing. She came back to the great room. She set her pack down against the wall near the fireplace. The stone would hold some warmth, and lowered herself to sit on the floor with her back against it, and her legs stretched out in front of her. She was exhausted down to somewhere below her bones. Her heel throbbed. She was genuinely hungry now, not the uncomfortable hunger of a skipped meal, but the particular hollowness that comes from walking 40 miles on a half loaf of cornbread and a piece of hard cheese. She sat there for a while in the cold, ruined room. She thought about Harold Briggs pointing at the door without standing up from his chair. She thought about her mother's hands on the sink. She thought about the way the clerk had looked at her coins, like he expected her to fail before the ink dried on the deed. Then she stopped thinking about any of that, because none of it was useful. She had shelter. She had a property deed. She had a farrier's rasp and a notebook full of practical knowledge and 2 blistered feet that had covered 40 miles in 2 days, which meant they worked. She had at this particular moment exactly nothing else. She pulled her blanket out of the pack and wrapped it around her shoulders and sat with her back against the cold stone of a fireplace that had stood cold for 11 years. In a house that nobody believed she could save, on land nobody thought she could work, and she made a quiet, private decision. She would not be what Harold Briggs expected. She would not be what the woman outside the feed merchant expected. She would not be what the clerk expected, or the people who laughed when a heavy-set-year-old girl with muddy boots and $2 called herself a buyer. She was going to build something here. She didn't know yet what it would look like. She didn't know yet how she was going to eat tomorrow, or what the first problem would be out of the several hundred problems she could see from where she was sitting. She didn't have a plan so much as a direction, and she had learned from her father that sometimes a direction was enough to start. She pulled the blanket tighter. Outside, the wind came through the empty windows and moved through the ruined rooms, and the chimney moaned low and hollow above the cold hearth, and the orchard beyond the cracked glass shifted and rustled in the gray spring light. Nobody was watching. Nobody was waiting to see if she made it. That was, she decided, one of the better things about having nothing left to lose. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would start. She woke up before dawn with her back aching from the stone floor and something moving in the far corner of the room. She lay still for a moment, listening. Whatever it was, a rat, most likely. Possibly something larger. It went quiet after a few seconds. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her back registering its complaint one by one, and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and waited for enough light to see by. The cold was serious. Not the damp cold of a house that had been closed up for a season, but the deep, settled cold of a place that had not held heat in over a decade. The stone walls had been absorbing it for 11 winters. She could feel it coming through the floor, under her, through the wall she'd been leaning against, through the air she was breathing. She needed fire. She needed food more than fire, but fire was achievable this morning, and food was going to require considerably more work. She got up, folded the blanket, and began moving through the house in the gray pre-dawn light, checking what she had to work with. The hearth was massive, the kind of fireplace, built for a house that expected to be heated by nothing else in the chimney, despite the collapsed cap and the birds' nests, still drew. She could feel the pull of air when she held her hand near the opening. Whatever lived up there would have to be persuaded to relocate, which was going to be an unpleasant project for another morning. She found a rusted hatchet hanging on a peg in the outbuilding that had been a forge. The handle was loose, the head was usable. She spent 20 minutes tightening it with strips of leather she cut from the edge of her blanket, not the part she slept under. The edge, the part that had already started fraying, and then she went outside into the early morning and began splitting deadfall from the fallen orchard branches that had been lying in the weeds, long enough to dry out. The hatchet kept slipping. Her hands were cold. She split enough wood for a small fire, carried it inside, and spent another 10 minutes coaxing a flame from a nest of dry leaves and the smallest pieces of wood she could manage, using a spark from 2 stones she'd found in the hearth ash. Her father had shown her this when she was 9. She'd thought at the time it was just something interesting to know. She understood now that he had been teaching her a different lesson entirely, one about what it meant to be prepared for circumstances you couldn't predict. The fire caught. She sat in front of it, with her hands extended, and waited for feeling to come back into her fingers. The smoke went up. The chimney worked. That was one problem that had answered itself. By the time the light outside had turned fully gray, and the birds in the orchard had started their morning noise, she had a small fire going and a clear picture of her immediate situation, which was this. She had no food, no money, 1 loose hatchet, her father's rasp, a notebook, a wool blanket with a cut edge, and about 40 acres of problems. She also had a deed in her pack that said she owned all of it. She put the rasp in her coat pocket and went to find breakfast. It took her most of the morning. She found a patch of early watercress at the creek's edge, which tasted like cold water and determination, but was at least something. She found 3 eggs in a nest a bird had made in the collapsed section of the back rooms, which she hard-cooked in a tin cup she'd discovered hanging on a nail in the forge outbuilding. She ate everything slowly and drank creek water and went back to work. The work that first week was not dramatic. It was not the kind of effort that made for a good story. It was brutal, repetitive, unglamorous labor, hauling rotted timber out of the collapsed rooms, clearing debris from the floor, boarding up 2 of the open windows with planks she pried from the collapsed roof sections, checking the integrity of every wall by pressing her hands against the stone and feeling for movement. The house had been built by someone who understood construction. The bones were sound. The neglect was catastrophic, but it was surface neglect, the kind that corrected if you had time and stubbornness, and Mara currently had both. She was hungry most of the time. She was also aware, with a clarity she hadn't expected, that she was not going to survive on watercress and found eggs. She needed income before she needed anything else. She needed it within the next week, or she was going to have to make decisions she didn't want to make. On her 4th morning at Ashwick, she went into Briar Hollow. She walked the 1.5 miles into town with her father's rasp in her coat pocket and her notebook under her arm. And she went first to the general store and stood in front of the notice board near the door and read every card pinned to it. 3 people wanted firewood cut. 1 person needed a fence repaired. A farmer named Galt on the South Road had posted that his draft horse had gone lame, and the blacksmith couldn't see him until Thursday. It was Tuesday. She went to the South Road. Galt's farm was a working operation, not prosperous, but functional, with the particular organized chaos look of a place where 1 person was trying to manage more than 1 person could reasonably manage. He was in the yard when she walked up the track. A wiry man in his 40s, with the permanent squint of someone who spent his days outdoors, and the expression of someone who had not recently had anything go right. He looked at her the way everyone in Briar Hollow looked at her. She had begun to catalog the variations. There was the version that was openly dismissive. There was the version that was surprised and then dismissive. There was the version that was polite and then quietly dismissive after she left. Galt's version was the fourth kind, where a man was in enough trouble that he was willing to suspend his skepticism temporarily if there was a chance it might solve his problem. "You know farrier work," he said. "Yes," she said. "Blacksmith's booked, and my horse has been off his left front for 3 days. I've got to get him to the mill by Thursday. Let me look at him." The horse was a big gray gelding, 16 hands at least, with the stubborn patience of an animal that had been working hard for years without complaint. He was standing with his weight shifted off the left front leg, not dramatically, but consistently, the way horses did when something hurt enough to bother them, but not enough to stop them entirely. Mara took her time. She ran her hand down the leg slowly, feeling for heat. She lifted the hoof and held it between her knees and used the rasp handle to tap the wall in a slow progression around the toe. The horse flinched at the left rear of the toe. "Stone bruise," she said, "maybe 4 days old. There's some heat here, not bad. He needs the hoof cleaned out. There's debris packed in the sulcus, and then he wants to be off hard ground until the tenderness goes down. Can he pull to the mill Thursday?" She considered this honestly. On packed dirt road, probably yes. On stone or hard clay, I wouldn't push it. Wrap the hoof in burlap if he has to go on hard surface. It'll help. She cleaned the hoof herself, using the rasp to clear the debris, working carefully around the bruised section. The horse shifted once, then stood. Galt watched her without speaking. When she finished, she lowered the hoof and stood. "How much?" Galt asked. "A meal and whatever you can spare from the smokehouse." He looked at her. "That's all?" he said. "I'm new to the area," she said. "I need word to travel more than I need money right now." He gave her a meal, salt pork and beans, eaten at the kitchen table, while his wife watched her with an expression somewhere between curiosity and caution, and when she left, he pressed a cloth-wrapped parcel into her hands at the door. Smoked ham, a piece of cornbread, and a small jar of rendered lard. "I'll tell Hennessy at the mill," Galt said. "He's got a mare that's been giving him trouble." She walked back to Ashwick in the early afternoon, carrying the parcel and the quiet, precarious satisfaction of a person who had just solved the immediate problem of not starving, knowing full well that the problem would be back again tomorrow. She cooked the salt pork over the hearth fire that evening and ate more than she probably should have, because she'd been under-eating for 5 days and her body was insisting on making up the difference. She sat in front of the fire afterward and opened her notebook and made notes. The gray geldings issue, the treatment, what she'd observed about Galt's farm setup, which farmers in the area might have horses. She was building a map in her head. Her father had done the same. He'd called it working the territory. She fell asleep with the notebook in her lap and the fire burning low. And for the first time since she'd walked off Harold Briggs's porch, she did not lie awake listening to the dark. She was too tired. Hennessy at the mill did have a mare with problems. So did a farmer named Pruitt 2 miles east. By the end of her second week at Ashwick, Mara had worked on 6 horses in and around Briar Hollow, and while she had charged modest amounts, sometimes food, sometimes small amounts of coin, she had done something more valuable than earn money. She had made herself visible as a person who knew what she was doing. That reputation was fragile. She understood that. One bad outcome would cost her 3 good ones. So she was careful. She only took on cases she understood. She referred one horse to the blacksmith in town because the issue was structural and needed work she couldn't do without an anvil and proper shoeing tools, and that referral, counterintuitively, helped her more than if she'd tried to manage it herself, because the blacksmith mentioned it to someone, and the someone mentioned it to someone else, and the word that came back was that the heavy-set girl at Ashwick knew her limits. In a town full of people willing to overpromise, that was noticed. Still, by the end of her second week, she had collected roughly $2.40 in coin, 3 jars of preserved goods, a sack of cornmeal, and about 8 pounds of smoked and salted meat. The house was marginally more habitable. She'd managed to patch one of the open windows. With oilskin she'd traded a morning of labor and she'd cleared the debris from 3 of the 4 intact rooms, but the back section with the collapsed roof was still open to the weather, which meant any serious rain was going to become a serious problem. She was surviving. She was not yet living. There was a significant distance between the two. She was thinking about that distance on a particular Tuesday morning, sitting in the great room with her coffee. She'd traded an hour of work for a small portion of ground coffee, and she was rationing it carefully, which meant it was mostly hot water with ambition when she's noticed something about the floor. She had been moving around the great room for 2 weeks. She knew every stone in the floor. She knew which ones were cracked, which ones were stable, which ones sat slightly proud of their neighbors and caught her toe if she wasn't paying attention. She had not noticed, until this particular morning, that one section of the floor near the fireplace behaved differently under her weight. It was a subtle thing. Not a sound the stone was too thick and too heavy for sound, but a feeling, a very slight, almost imperceptible give. Not structural give, not the flex of a failing foundation, something different. Something that felt almost like a seam. She set her coffee down. She got on her hands and knees and pressed her palms flat against the floor in that section, moving systematically from stone to stone. Most of them were solid, the density of objects that had been in place for generations integrated into the ground beneath them. But in one section, maybe 3 stones wide by 2 stones deep, directly in front of the left side of the great fireplace, there was something different. Not weakness, not failure, just differentness. She got the rusted hatchet and used the handle end as a tap, moving it slowly across the stones in that section, listening to the sound it made. The rest of the floor sounded flat. These stones sounded fractionally hollow. She sat back and looked at the hearth. She had been using this fireplace for 2 weeks. She had swept it out, examined the back wall, checked the damper. She had looked at every visible part of it. She had not looked beneath it. She took her father's rasp, the tool she'd been using as a pry bar for small jobs since she got here, and worked it carefully into the seam between the hearthstone and the first floor stone to the left of it. The seam was wider than she'd realized. Someone had mortared it, but the mortar was old and had dried to powder in the years of disuse. She worked the rasp along the seam for several minutes. Then she put her weight on it. The stone shifted. She stopped. She sat there for a moment, with her heart doing something irregular. Then she got the hatchet and worked the handle into the seam as well, creating a wider lever, and this time when she pushed down the stone, moved cleanly, not collapsing, not breaking, but lifting, pivoting on one edge like something designed to do exactly this. Beneath it was a cavity. It was roughly 2 feet deep, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet wide, lined with flat stones that had been mortared carefully into place. It was dry, completely dry, in a way that the rest of the house's basement was not, suggesting the cavity had been sealed with some deliberateness. Inside it was a cloth sack, rotted nearly to the point of dissolution, held together more what was inside it than by its own fibers. She could see the shapes through the fabric, rounded, irregular. She reached in and lifted the sack. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on the floor beside the open cavity and pulled the rotted cloth apart with careful hands. 14 gold pieces spilled out onto the stone floor. $20 gold pieces. She picked one up. The minting date was 1861. They were real. They were solid and heavy and unmistakably, impossibly real. She sat there on the cold stone floor of the great room with 14 $20 gold coins in a scatter around her knees, and for a long moment she did not move or speak or breathe particularly well. $280. In 1872, that was not just money. That was a life. That was a year of wages for a working man, more than most families in Briar Hollow would see in 18 months. That was the difference between survival and possibility. She looked back into the cavity. There was something else. An ivory brooch, small and carefully carved, wrapped in a piece of oilskin that had preserved it almost perfectly. And beneath that, a folded letter, sealed with wax. The wax cracked, but the paper inside still intact. She opened it carefully, the paper fragile at the folds but legible. The handwriting was a woman's, careful, precise. The handwriting of someone who had learned to write when writing was considered a serious skill and had practiced it seriously. Whoever finds this, I do not know your name or your circumstances, and I cannot know whether this letter reaches you in a time of great need or modest comfort. I am Lenora Ashwick, and this house and this land have been my home for 31 years. My husband built this house. We raised our children here. We buried 2 of them here, and that grief is part of this land as much as the soil is, and I leave it here because it belongs here and not anywhere else. The money in this cavity represents the savings of this family across many years. I hid it during uncertain times when I did not trust that it would remain safe otherwise. I am writing this letter because I am old and my health is not reliable, and I want to set down my wishes before I am no longer able to. If you have found this, you are living in this house. That means someone has returned to Ashwick. That is all I ever wanted, not that my children return, for I have made my peace with their choices, but that this house and this land be lived in. Again, worked again, made into something. Use the money to repair the roof. The south field drains poorly after heavy rain. My husband always meant to cut a channel there and never did. The orchard wants pruning back to the main scaffold branches. The bees were kept in 4 hives at the east side of the orchard, and they may have gone wild by now, but they can be reclaimed if you are patient. I do not know who you are. I hope you are someone who needs this more than they need anything else. Take care of what was built here. That is all I ask. Lenora Ashwick, October 1860. Mara read the letter twice. Then she sat with it in her lap for a long time, looking at the gold coins. Ik had een niemand haunted her, and the brooch in its oilskin wrapping, and the open cavity in the floor with its careful stone lining, and the fire burning low in the great hearth that this woman had built her life around for 31 years. She had enough money right now to walk away. She had enough to go back east, find a room somewhere decent, buy tools, set herself up in a town that already had farrier work waiting. She could leave Ashwick's ruined roof and its overgrown orchard and its poorly draining south field to the county. Nobody would think less of her. Most people would think she'd made the sensible choice. She collected the coins. She counted them again, still 14, still $20 each. She wrapped them carefully in the piece of oilskin from the brooch, because the brooch could sit in the open air, and the coins needed to stay dry. She placed Lenora's letter flat inside her notebook, between 2 pages, and pressed them together. She picked up the brooch and turned it over in her hands. It was carved ivory, a small oval, a bird in flight, wings head turned, beautifully made. She wrapped it in a clean corner of cloth from her pack and put it carefully in the inside pocket of her coat where it would be safe. Then she replaced the hearthstone. She told no one. Not Galt, not Hennessy, not the woman at the general store who had begun to say good morning to her with slightly more warmth than the first 2 weeks. Not the clerk at the land office who still looked at her with the expression of a man waiting to be proven right about something. She told no one because she had thought it through carefully and concluded that the moment people in Briar Hollow knew that the heavyset girl at the ruined farm had $280 in gold hidden under her hearth, her situation would change in ways she could not fully control. People would make assumptions. People would have opinions about what she ought to do with it. People who had not spoken to her in 3 weeks would suddenly find her interesting. She had no interest in being interesting for the wrong reasons. She spent 3 days making a careful list. Cedar shakes for the roof, the back section, and the sections that were currently patched with oilskin and prayers. Window glass for the 4 empty frames. Nails, which she was desperately short on. Seed for the fields, if she could get the south field turned and drained before planting season. Lime for the walls. A proper set of farrier tools. She'd been working with her father's single rasp and borrowed equipment, which was like trying to cook a meal with 1 pan and someone else's fire. Livestock, eventually a milk goat at minimum. Chickens if she could manage a coop. She wrote the numbers down next to each item. She crossed things out and rewrote them. Most of its windows were dark. She arranged the list in order of what would keep her alive first, what would make the farm functional second, what would make it productive third. The roof was first. Not because she could do it alone, she couldn't, but because without a sound roof, the rest of the list was academic. You could not store grain in a building with open sky above 2 of its rooms. You could not winter livestock in a barn with the same problem. You could not do anything in a house that was essentially still partly outdoors. She went to find Gideon Rusk. She'd heard his name from 3 different people in 3 different conversations. Over the past 2 weeks, the aging carpenter who'd built or repaired what felt like half the structures in Redfern Valley, who had been working alone since his 2 apprentices went elsewhere, who was apparently difficult to work with, but genuinely skilled. Galt had mentioned him. Hennessy had mentioned him. A woman at the general store named Tilda Mercer had mentioned him in the context of a neighbor's barn, shaking her head slightly in the way people did when describing a person who was competent but complicated. Difficult she could handle. She found him at his workshop on the north side of town, a building that was itself an advertisement for his skill. Every joint clean and tight and level in a way that suggested the man who built it had opinions about corners. He was planing a board when she came in, and he did not look up. "Not buying anything today," he said. "I'm not selling anything," Mara said. "I need a roofer. I've got the Ashwick property on the Creek Road." He stopped planing and looked up at her then. He was perhaps 65, with the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of expression into something that was just permanent. Gray-bearded, deliberate, with hands that looked like they'd been built specifically for the work they'd spent 50 years doing. "Ashwick," he said. "Nobody's touched that place in 11 years. I bought it 3 weeks ago." He looked at her steadily. "Roof's in bad shape, 2 rooms open to the sky. The rest is patched, but not sound. What kind of budget are you working with?" "Enough for cedar shakes, nails, and your labor at a fair rate. I'm not here to lowball you, and I'm not here to be lowballed." He set plane down on the board and crossed his arms and studied her with the thorough appraisal of a man who had spent 65 years figuring out whether people were worth his time. "When do you want to start?" he said. "As soon as you can." "I can look at it Thursday, she said. She walked out of Gideon Rusk's workshop with the first piece of a larger thing beginning to take shape. And behind her she could hear him pick up the plane again and continue exactly where he'd left off, unbothered, as if the transaction had cost him nothing, which she supposed it hadn't yet. The cost was coming, but so was everything else. Thursday morning, Gideon Rusk arrived at Ashwick at 7 o'clock with a wagon, 2 apprentices she hadn't known about, young men of roughly 17, who moved with the watchful quiet of people still learning how to work, and an expression that suggested he had already formed opinions about what he would find and was prepared to be confirmed. He walked the property in silence for 30 minutes. He climbed a ladder to the roof. His apprentices held it. She noticed, without being asked, the automatic choreography of people who had done this 100 times, and he walked the ridge and crouched in several places and pressed his palm against the remaining shakes the way she pressed her palms against the floor when she was checking for trouble. He came back down and stood in the yard. "South slope is worse than the north," he said. "Some of the rafters want replacing, not just the shakes. 2 of them are rotted through at the wall plate. What does that add to the work? Maybe 4 days. Maybe 5. "What's the rate?" he told her. It was fair. Not cheap, but fair, which was all she'd asked for. "There's one condition," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I work alongside you." The eyebrow went up slightly further. "You've done roof work? Enough to be useful and not enough to slow you down. I'll follow your direction." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the roof. "All right," he said, and he went to the wagon to begin unloading. She spent the next 5 days on that roof. It was not romantic. It was not the kind of labor that felt triumphant in the moment it felt. In the moment, like sore knees and cut hands, and the particular terror of being 30 feet above the ground on a slope that was less stable than it looked, with a hammer that kept sliding on the pitch. She dropped 3 nails for every 2 she drove. Gideon corrected technique twice on the first day and once on the second, and after that seemed to decide she was a reasonable student and mostly left her to manage. His apprentices watched her. She could feel them doing it not hostily, but with the sideways attention of young men trying to recategorize something that didn't fit their existing understanding. A woman on a roof, working, not watching working. On the 3rd day, one of them, the shorter one, whose name turned out to be Cal, handed her a nail without being asked. When he saw she was running low. Small things. By the 5th day, the roof was sound. Not beautiful, Gideon was the first to say it, with the pained honesty of a man whose standards had been compromised by available materials and time, but sound. Watertight. The rotted rafters had been replaced. The ridge was solid. Rain would stay outside. Mara stood in what had been the open rooms and looked up at actual ceiling and felt something she couldn't quite name, not pride exactly. More like the physical sensation of a problem being solved, which was its own particular satisfaction, separate from happiness. She paid Gideon in cash, counted out carefully from the coins she'd been keeping in the inside pocket of her coat alongside Lenora's brooch. He took the money, folded it without counting it, a gesture that meant either he trusted her arithmetic or he considered recounting money rude, and turned to supervise his apprentices loading the wagon. "The south field," he said, without turning around. "Lenora Ashwick's husband always meant to drain it. Never did." She looked at him. "You knew her," Mara said. "My father built the second wing of this house," Gideon said. "Lenora Ashwick gave him 2 weeks of work when he needed it." He climbed onto the wagon seat. "The channel wants to run northeast to the lower field edge. That's the natural gradient." He clicked at the horse and drove away without looking back. She stood in the yard and watched him go. She'd thought she was the only one who knew what this land had once been. She was beginning to understand that places like Ashwick carried their history in the people around them, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Inside the house, the hearthstone sat undisturbed. Beneath it, Lenora's gold waited. And Mara Whitcombe, 20 years old and increasingly certain that she had made exactly the right decision about where to spend it, went inside to add the channel notes to her notebook and begin working out what it would take to turn the south field before the season ran out. The channel notes sat in the notebook for 2 weeks before Mara had time to do anything serious about them. There was always something more immediate. The window glass arrived from the supplier in Carver's Crossing, and she spent 2 days fitting panes into the empty frames, learning as she went that cutting glass was an exercise in patience she hadn't known she needed. The first pane cracked wrong, and she lost a quarter of it. The second she got right. By the fourth, she had developed a reliable technique and a thorough understanding of why glaziers charged what they charged. Then one of the 2 milk goats she'd purchased from a farm south of town stopped eating, and she spent 3 days trying to figure out why before concluding. It was a tooth issue, a broken molar she could feel when she got her hand far enough into the animal's mouth to check, and there was nothing she could do about a broken molar, except adjust the animal's feed to softer material until the soreness eased. The goat recovered. Mara developed a permanent wariness about purchasing livestock without checking the teeth first. Then the forge needed attention. The forge outbuilding was the structure that had the most potential and the most problems simultaneously. The firebox was intact, good fire brick, well laid, the kind of construction that lasted if it wasn't actively destroyed, but the bellows had rotted, the anvil was missing entirely, and the drainage around the base of the building had failed so completely that every significant rain pushed water under the floor and left the earth inside damp for a week afterward. Without drainage, the forge floor would never fully dry. Without a dry floor, she couldn't safely run the fire. Without the fire, she was limited to cold work, which meant she could file and rasp and trim, but she couldn't shape, couldn't set a shoe properly on a horse with a hoof that needed correction rather than just maintenance. She fixed the drainage, first 2 days with cutting a slope around the perimeter of the building and packing stone into the channel to keep it from silting closed. Then she sourced a used set of bellows from Gideon, who had apparently collected spare parts from every structure he'd ever worked on and kept them in a shed behind his workshop in a state of organized archival chaos. "Bellows," he'd said when she asked. He'd gone into the shed without another word and come back 2 minutes later with exactly what she needed. He named a price. She paid it. He went back inside. That was the nature of their relationship, entirely transactional on the surface, which was the only surface Gideon appeared to have. But she'd noticed over the weeks since the roof work that he had begun stopping by Ashwick, occasionally on his way through on other business. Never for long, never with any announced purpose. He'd look at what she was working on, make 1 or 2 comments that were either observations or implied suggestions, depending on how you listened to them, and then drive on. The anvil was a different problem. A good anvil was expensive. A used anvil was merely costly. She spent a week asking around before Jonas Creed at the mill mentioned that there was an anvil sitting unused in his equipment barn, had been there for years, belonged to a blacksmith who'd worked for the mill operation years ago, and eventually moved on without taking it. "You're welcome to it," Jonas said with a directness that surprised her. "Lenora Ashwick helped my family when we had nothing to help ourselves with. Feels right to pass something along." He said it matter-of-factly, without ceremony, and went back to discussing the grain she'd brought in for milling. She didn't press him on it. The anvil was real, and it was heavy, and she borrowed Galt's wagon to move it, which took most of a morning and left her back angry. for 2 days, but when it was finally set on its oak block in the forge, and she struck it once with a hammer to hear the ring, she stood in the dim outbuilding and felt the particular satisfaction of a tool in the right place for the first time in a long time. The forge came alive 2 weeks later, properly alive, with actual fire and actual heat, and the smell of hot iron that she had first learned to love when she was 9 years old, watching her father work. She spent the first afternoon just running the fire and working small pieces of scrap iron she'd collected, getting the feel of the heat, reminding her hands of what they knew. She made a mistake on the third piece and had to start over. She made another mistake on the sixth and abandoned that one too. By the time she'd banked the fire for the evening, she had produced one serviceable set of clips for a halter repair and a hook for the barn wall that was functional, if not elegant. Her father would have had opinions about the hook. She hung it on the barn wall anyway. It was around this time that Tilda Mercer came by. Tilda was the woman Mara had seen in passing at the general store over the weeks. Since arriving in Briar Hollow, a woman of perhaps 50, compact and practical, with the kind of face that had settled into a permanent expression of considering things carefully before speaking. She'd been the one who mentioned Gideon's name that first week. She'd nodded to Mara occasionally in town, but she had not come to the farm. She came on a Wednesday afternoon in early summer with a covered basket and the slightly self-conscious air of a person doing something they've decided to do, despite mild uncertainty about whether it's welcome. Mara was in the yard, trimming the hooves on a neighbor's pony, a small, opinionated animal named, apparently, Biscuit, who had strong views about being handled and had been expressing them steadily for the past 20 minutes when Tilda came through the gate. "Is this a bad time?" Tilda said. "It's a fine time," Mara said, without looking up from Biscuit's left rear hoof. "She's just making her feelings known." Tilda set the basket on the porch railing and watched. Biscuit expressed another feeling. Mara absorbed it without drama and continued working. "She does that with my neighbor's boy too," Tilda said. "He just drops the hoof and walks away." "That's what she wants," Mara said. "She's figured out it works." She finished the hoof, lowered it carefully, and straightened up. Biscuit turned to look at her with the expression of an animal deciding whether this round had been a win or a loss. "What's in the basket?" Mara said. "Cornbread and a jar of soft cheese I made Tuesday, and some dried apple if you want it." Tilda paused. "I've been meaning to come sooner. I kept finding reasons not to." Mara wiped her hands on her work cloth. "Why?" Tilda seemed to appreciate the directness. Because everyone in this town has been watching to see whether you'd last, and I didn't want to be one of the people who came by when it looked like you might." "You're here now," Mara said. "You've lasted longer than anyone expected," Tilda said. "Including me, if I'm honest." They ate the cornbread on the porch. Mara had finally repaired the porch boards 2 weeks prior, another afternoon of careful work with salvaged lumber, and Tilda looked at the house and the yard with the assessing eye of a woman who understood what it took to keep a property functional. "The orchard wants serious attention," Tilda said. "I know," Mara said. "I've been reading about pruning in my notebook. My father wrote about fruit trees, but I haven't had time to get into it properly. My husband kept an orchard. I pruned it every winter for 20 years before he passed." She looked at the tangled mass of unpruned pear and apple trees at the east edge of the property. "I could show you what wants doing." Mara looked at her. "Why would you do that?" Tilda considered. "Because you remind me of someone who needed help once and didn't get enough of it soon enough," she said. "And because the alternative is sitting in my house thinking about it and not doing anything, which I've been doing since February, and I'm tired of it." The orchard work began the following Saturday. It was slow, and it was demanding in a way Mara hadn't anticipated. Pruning was not the brute physical work of hauling timber or digging drainage channels. It was careful and judgment-based, and required a fluency with fruit tree architecture that Tilda had and Mara was building from scratch. Most of its windows were dark. They worked side by side for 3 Saturdays before Mara felt like she understood the principle well enough to do useful work without Tilda standing next to her. The principle was this: you were not trying to make the tree look the way you wanted it to look. You were trying to reveal the structure that was already there, remove what was competing with it, and give the remaining branches enough light and air to do what they were designed to do. The tree knew what it was supposed to be. You were just helping it remember. Mara wrote this in her notebook. Then she crossed out the last sentence, because it was too tidy, too conclusive, and her father had always told her that orchard work was an ongoing argument with something that had its own ideas, not a problem you solved and once and walked away from. By the end of the third Saturday, they had pruned 12 trees, nearly half the orchard. The remaining branches were clean. The crossing wood was gone. Light was getting into the canopy. 3 of the trees were in poor enough condition that Tilda said honestly they might not come back to full production, but they were worth keeping until she knew for certain. Tilda began coming on Wednesdays too, not always for orchard work, but sometimes just to sit on the porch with coffee and talk. She knew Briar Hollow the way people know places they've lived for 40 years, not as information but as texture. The accumulated understanding of who connected to who and why, and what had happened to whom and when. She told Schneer things without framing them as useful, but they were useful, which farmers were struggling and might need farrier work but were too proud to seek it out, which families were tight-knit and helped each other, and which ones were isolated, which pieces of land around who offered, which pieces of land around the valley had water problems, similar to Ashwick's South Field. Mara listened to all of it and said little and added to the map she was building in her head. The South Field drainage channel happened in pieces. She couldn't do it alone, not the full length of it, which ran northeast for nearly 200 feet to the lower field edge where Gideon had told her the natural gradient would carry the water. She could dig a section a day when she had no horse work scheduled and the weather cooperated, which was less often than she'd have liked. June was dry enough that the field work was not urgent, but she could read the sky and her father's notes both, and she knew that the spring rains in this valley were not a question of if, but when, and when they came, the South Field would go underwater within 6 hours if the channel wasn't finished. She worked on it most mornings when the light was good. Some days she moved 15 feet of channel. Some days she moved 8. She hit a section of dense clay in the middle stretch that turned 3 days of work into 5, because clay didn't move willingly, and the spade kept bouncing off it in a way that made her shoulders ache down to the socket. Galt came by one afternoon while she was in the channel up to her knees in clay and looked at the situation for a long moment. "You're in the hard pan," he said. "I know," she said without stopping. "Want a hand?" She looked up. She almost said no. She'd been saying no reflexively for months, to every offer that felt like it came with an expectation attached. But Galt's face was just practical. No pity in it, no calculation she could identify. "If you've got time," she said. He got a spade from his wagon. They dug together for 2 hours without much conversation. By the time he left, they'd moved 20 feet through the hard pan, and the remaining clay ahead looked softer. "Appreciate it," she said. "You fixed my horse," he said, and drove away. That was how the transactions in Briar Hollow worked. She was learning. Not charity, not debt, but a kind of running account that people kept imprecisely and settled in whatever form was available. She finished the channel on a Thursday in late June, 3 days before the first serious summer rain arrived. It was not a dramatic moment. She cut the last section through to the lower field edge, cleared the outlet so the water had a clean path, and stood back and looked at what she'd done, a long, slightly uneven line cut through the south field, banked with the clay she'd excavated, running northeast, exactly as Gideon had said it should. She went back to the house and made coffee and wrote 4 lines in her notebook about drainage gradients and went to bed. The rain came on Sunday. It came the way serious rain comes not all at once but in waves, each one heavier than the last. Starting before dawn and building through the morning until by midday the creek road was running an inch of water, and the sky looked like a ceiling dropped to eye level. Mara stood at the front window and watched the south field and waited. The water rose in the field. She could see it sheeting across the surface, running toward the low section the way water always ran toward low ground, pooling in the corner nearest the creek. Then it found the channel. It was not dramatic. It did not race. It's simply directed, the way water always eventually found the path that cost it the least, and that path was now the channel she had spent 6 weeks digging through clay and hard pan, and the water ran northeast and drained, and the field held. The standing water in the south corner rose another inch, then another, then began to drop. She watched for an hour. The field held. She went back to bed. She did not tell anyone about the channel for another week. when Tilda came on Wednesday, and Mara mentioned it in the context of discussing the field layout, and Tilda stopped her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. "That south section drained?" she said, through a channel to the lower field edge. Lenora Ashwick's husband talked about doing that for years. Tilda set the cup down. "How long did it take you?" "About 6 weeks of mornings, and 2 hours with Galt in the hard pan." Tilda looked at her with an expression Mara had not seen on her face before, something between an admiration and something more complicated. The look of a person recalibrating an assumption they hadn't known they were still carrying. "You just dug a drainage channel through 40 feet of hard clay," Tilda said. "Clay and some gravel on the near end," Mara said. "On your own," Tilda said. "Mostly," Ma said. Tilda picked her coffee cup back up. She said nothing for a moment. "Then you're going to be all right here." It was not a question by that point. The planting happened in late June and early July. Corn and beans and squash in the south field, a kitchen garden behind the house with vegetables she could use through the summer and put up for winter. She'd purchased seed from Jonas Creed at the mill, who had given her a fair price and asked no questions, and she'd prepared the beds herself, sost, turning the soil with a spade until her hands were permanently dirty and her shoulders had accepted their new condition and stopped complaining. The corn went in crooked in several rows because she was learning, and the string line she'd set kept shifting in the wind, and she straightened what she could and left the rest and decided that crooked corn was still corn. Her father had told her that a perfect field was a field nobody was actually farming. The bees were found on a Tuesday. She had been moving around the east edge of the orchard, checking on the prune trees, when she heard the sound for the particular low, continuous hum that you didn't hear so much as feel in the back of your teeth, and she stopped walking and stood very still and listened. There, in the corner of the orchard where an old stone wall had partially collapsed and created a series of sheltered gaps between the stones, was a colony. Possibly, too, the activity level at 2 separate gaps in the wall suggested they might have split at some point, and each half had taken its own space in the stone. Lenora had mentioned bees in her letter. 4 hives at the east side of the orchard. The hives were long gone. She'd found the rotted wood of what might have been 2 of them months ago and cleared the debris, without understanding what she was clearing. But the bees had not gone wild, so much as gone native, moved themselves from managed hives into Kamsnoens, the stone wall, and built there, season after season, with no one to harvest or manage them or do anything except leave them alone. She stood at a respectful distance and watched the activity at the wall for a long time. She knew enough about bees to respect them, and not enough about them to move them safely. This was one of the items in her notebook, where her father's knowledge ended, and her own began. There were 3 pages of his observations on hive management, written in his particular, dense shorthand, but they were notes from reading rather than from doing, which meant they were a foundation and not a guide. She went to Jonas Creed, who knew everything adjacent to everything in Redfern Valley. "Bees in the orchard wall," she said. 2 colonies, looks like. "I want to know who in the valley keeps hives and would talk to me about management." Jonas didn't hesitate. "Vera Osgood on the Wayfield Road. She's got 15 hives, and she's been keeping them for 30 years. Tell her I sent you." Vera Osgood turned out to be a woman of about 70 who had the quiet, unhurried certainty of someone who had spent decades working with something that would not tolerate panic or impatience. She received Mara's visit without ceremony and listened to the description of the stone wall colonies without interrupting. "Leave them until fall," she said. "Don't try to move them in summer. In fall, when the colony's smaller and the weather's cooler, you can take a section of the wall apart carefully and relocate them to boxes. If you rush it, you'll lose half the colony, or kill the queen and lose all of it. Will you show me in the fall? Come help me with my harvest in August," Vera said. "You'll learn more in a day of harvest than in a month of reading about it." Mara went to help with the harvest in August. She got stung 4 times. She learned more in that day than in a month of reading about it. The horsework had been growing steadily through the summer quietly, without announcement, in the way that reputation travels in small communities when the work is consistently good. By midsummer, she was seeing 2 or 3 horses a week, enough to keep the forge busy on the days she wasn't doing field work or orchard work, or one of the dozen other things that kept a 40-acre farm in continuous need of attention. She was not getting rich. She was covering costs, building a small reserve, learning the particular economy of a farming community, where money was often less available than goods and services, and transactions happened in whatever medium was mutually convenient. She was also, without quite noticing when it had begun, being included. Not warmly included, not in the way of a community that had decided to embrace someone. Briar Hollow was not that kind of town, and Mara was not the kind of person who sought embracing, but practically included, consulted about horse problems, asked about field drainage, invited to contribute an opinion about whether a particular piece of equipment was worth repairing or worth replacing. Galt would stop by when he was passing. Jonas Creed had started keeping her informed about who in the valley was having livestock trouble before they'd gotten around to asking for help themselves. Tilda came on Wednesdays and sometimes Saturdays. Gideon stopped by on a Monday in late July and stood in the yard looking at the repaired breezeway she'd fixed it herself, using lumber she'd salvaged from the collapsed sections of roof, spending 2 weekends getting the joints right for about 3 minutes without speaking. The left corner post wants a diagonal brace, he said. I know, she said. I'm going to add it this week. He nodded. He looked at the rest of the farm, the smoke coming from the forge, the goats in the small paddock, the kitchen garden going green and dense behind the house, the orchard with its pruned canopy now visibly different from the tangled mess it had been in March. Lenora would have been satisfied, he said, and got back in his wagon and drove on. She stood in the yard after he left and thought about that. Satisfied was not the same as impressed. Satisfied was not an endorsement or a celebration. It was an old man's honest assessment, which was the only kind he appeared to make, and it was enough. More than enough. It was high summer now, and Ashwick Farm was not the ruin it had been 6 months ago. The roof was sound. The windows held glass. The forge ran most mornings. The orchard was pruned. The south field had drained through the June rains and was growing corn that was crooked in places and green everywhere. The kitchen garden produced steadily. The goats were healthy, including the one with the bad tooth, who had developed a complicated relationship with Mara that involved occasional head butting as a form of greeting. She was still up before dawn most days. She was still hungry sometimes when the work outpaced the food supply. She still mistakes cut a hoof too close on a horse that was being difficult and spent 3 guilty days watching the animal carefully to make sure she hadn't caused damage she couldn't correct. She still had conversations with people in Briar Hollow where she could feel the old assessment working behind their eyes, the recalculation happening in real time, the slight discomfort of people updating a judgment they'd made quickly and confidently back in March. She had stopped caring about the discomfort, not because she'd risen above it, not because she'd found some resource of inner peace that made it irrelevant. She'd stopped caring because she no longer had energy to spend on it. The farm required too much. The horses required too much. The channel had required too much. The orchard and the bees and the forge and the goats and the crookedly planted corn all required something, and all of it together left her with very little capacity for caring about whether someone in Briar Hollow was currently in the process of revising their opinion of her. They could revise it or not. The corn would still need weeding either way. She was in the forge on a Thursday afternoon in late August, working on a set of shoes for a horse that Hennessy had brought over from the mill, a young animal that had been going barefoot too long and whose hooves had started to flare and crack at the walls when the sky outside the forge door went. Dark faster than it should have for the time of day. She stepped outside. The clouds coming from the northwest were not the gray uniform overcast of a normal summer rain. They were the tall, turbulent, yellow-edged clouds of a weather system that had gathered itself into something serious before anyone in the valley had time to prepare a useful opinion about it. She stood in the forge yard and looked at the sky, and then at the south field, and then at the creek, which she could hear. From here, or thought she could, though maybe that was imagination. She went to the south field and looked at the channel. The channel was open, clear, functional. She'd cleared debris from the outlet just last week. It would do what it was built to do. But the south field was not the only problem. Looking at the slope of the land from this elevation, something she hadn't done before, from this exact position in this specific light, with this particular quality of alarm sharpening her attention, she saw something she'd been too close to the individual problems to see before. The orchard. The orchard sat at the low point of the east side of the property, where the land sloped gently down from the north field before flattening out along the creek. In a normal rain, the drainage there was fine. The soil was deep and loose from decades of leaf decomposition, and it absorbed water readily. But in a serious rain, the kind that fell faster than soil could absorb it, water would sheet off the north field and pool at the orchard's edge. And if it pooled deep enough, long enough, it would stand around the tree roots. Young trees that had just been pruned back severely, that were putting energy into new growth, did not handle standing water around their roots well. Stressed trees handled it worse. 3 of the orchard trees that Tilda had flagged as questionable were in the lowest corner, exactly where the water would pool first. The sky was darker now. She went to find Galt. He was in his own yard when she came up the track at a pace that made him look up from what he was doing with an expression that shifted quickly from greeting to assessment. "The creek road goes under in a bad rain," she said without preamble. "How bad does it get?" "Bad," he said. "Last serious flood, 3 years back, the whole bottomland went under. Ashwick took water in the south-south field and the orchard both." "The orchard," she said. He nodded. "I need to cut a berm along the north field edge before this hits," she said. "Divert the sheet flow away from the orchard's low corner. I need help, and I need it now." He looked at the sky. He did not ask her if she was sure, which she appreciated. "I'll get Pruitt," he said. Pruitt was a farmer from east of the road who had the useful quality of moving quickly when a situation required it. He arrived in 40 minutes with a spade and a teenage son and no questions. Mara showed them where she needed the berm, not a channel this time, but a raised earthwork along the field's lower edge, just enough to redirect the sheet flow north and east away from the orchard corner. It was the inverse of the drainage channel logic. Instead of giving water a path to go, she was giving it a wall to deflect it. They dug for 2 hours, while the sky moved from dark to the particular green-gray that meant the rain was close. The berm was not deep or wide enough when the first drops came. She knew it wasn't. She kept digging. The rain hit properly about 20 minutes later, not the slow buildup of a normal storm, but the wall of water that serious weather brought, the kind that immediately overwhelmed every casual preparation and tested every serious one. Pruitt's son looked at the sky and then at Mara with the expression of someone wondering if they should be somewhere else. "Keep digging," she said. They kept digging. The water came off the north field in sheets. She could see it moving the surface of the soil, first darkening, then glistening, then running. It hit the berm and pushed, and the berm held the first wave, and the second, and on the third, the water found the low point at the east end of the berm, where they'd run out of time to build it high enough. "There," Mara said, pointing. They moved, all 4 of them piling earth at the east end of the berm, working in rain that was now falling hard enough that it was difficult to see clearly. The water pressed against the raised earth and spread, and found the new high point and redirected north, away from the orchard. Not all of it. Some water was already in the orchard corner, standing an inch deep around the base of the lowest trees, but not rising, draining slowly back through the soil, the deep loose soil that could handle an inch if it wasn't asked to handle 3. Mara stood its reins in the orchard corner, with water running off her hat brim in a continuous stream, and looked at the 3 trees Tilda had flagged. They were standing in an inch of water. The water was not rising. The berm was holding. She stood there until she was certain, and then she walked back through the rain to where Galt and Pruitt and the boy were standing at the field edge, looking at the berm with the expressions of men who were very wet and waiting to understand whether what they'd just done had worked. "It held," she said. Galt looked at the orchard corner. "How'd you know to do the berm?" he said. "I looked at the slope from the forge yard," she said. "I'd been thinking about the south field and the channel. But the channel doesn't help the orchard if the sheet flow off the north field is the problem." Pruitt looked at his son. His son was 17 and soaked to the skin, and had the expression of someone who had just done something harder than expected and was not entirely sure how to feel about it. "Good," Pruitt said finally. It was the most words Pruitt used for most things. They walked back through the rain to the yard. Galt and Pruitt loaded their tools in the wagon. The rain was beginning to ease slightly, the worst of it passing north and east toward the valley's far edge. "Come inside," Mara said. "There's coffee." She hadn't planned to say it. She said it anyway. They came inside. She made coffee in the great room while the rain ran off the now-sound roof, and the fire in the hearth worked against the damp. 4 people in the great room gulped on the chair she'd salvaged from the collapsed rooms. Pruitt and his son on the bench she'd built from reclaimed lumber. Mara leaning against the mantel, with her coffee getting warm again, slowly. Nobody said much. The rain said enough. Pruitt's son looked around the room at the repaired walls, the glass in the windows, the fire in the hearth, the notebook open on the table beside her, the ivory brooch sitting in its place on the mantel next to her father's rasp. This was a ruin, the boy said. Not disrespectful, just stating it. Still is some of it, Mara said. Not this part, he said. She looked at the room. He was right, she supposed. Not this part. Galt put his cup down when it was empty and stood. Creek Road's going to be soft, he said. We'll go before it gets worse. They went. She stood at the door and watched the wagon move down the track and out the gate and onto the road. And the rain was light now, the sky beginning to show gray-white along the western edge where the storm had passed through. She turned back into the house. The fire was low. She built it up. She stood at the window and looked at the orchard. She could just see the corner trees from here, the water receding from around their bases, the soil doing what soil does when given a chance to drain. She picked up Lenora's brooch from the mantel and turned it over in her hands. The bird in flight, wings spread, head turned, looking back at something or looking forward toward something. It was impossible to say from the carving which direction the bird considered forward. She put it back on the mantel next to her father's rasp and opened her notebook to the drainage channel notes and added 3 lines about berm construction and sheet flow and the angle of the Northfield slope, information she hadn't had before this afternoon and would not forget now. Outside, the creek ran high and fast, and the orchard dripped, and the berm held its shape in the softening ground. And Ashwick Farm had survived another thing that might have broken it if no one had been watching. Someone had been watching. She closed the notebook. The berm held through 2 more rains that September. Mara knew this because she checked it. After every significant storm, walked the orchard perimeter, looked at the corner trees, pressed her boot into the soil around their bases to test how much water was sitting. The first rain after the big storm was mild enough that the berm wasn't really tested. The second one, a week later, came hard and fast, the kind of rain that fell faster than the ground could process, and she stood at the forge door watching the north field sheet water south and felt the particular tension of a person waiting to find out if what they built was going to hold. It held. The orchard corner took a half-inch of standing water for about 2 hours, and then the berm redirected the flow and the water dropped. And by morning the soil was wet but not saturated, and the 3 trees Tilda had flagged were still standing with their roots intact and their new growth undamaged. Small victories. She'd learned to take them seriously. Fall came to Redfern Valley, the way fall came to most high country, not gradually, but in a series of cold fronts that arrived without particular announcement, and reminded everything living that the warm season had a hard limit. The corn in the south field went from green to dry in the span of 3 weeks. She harvested it over 4 days, working from first light until the light failed, her hands raw from the husking and her back registering every row she'd bent over. The most of its windows were dark. The yield was what an experienced farmer would have managed from the same ground she knew this, had known it would be this way, had planted knowing she was learning, and that learning cost something in the short term. But the ears were sound, and the kernels were good, and when she finished counting what was in the crib she had built against the barn wall, she had enough corn to feed the goats through winter and herself through spring, with grain left over for planting. The beans she put up in jars, Tilda, had come for 3 days in a row to help, bringing her own canning equipment and the kind of efficient, experienced instruction that assumed Mara was capable of learning quickly, and therefore gave her information at the rate she could actually absorb it, rather than the slower rate people usually offered to someone they didn't expect much from. They worked side by side in the kitchen. Mara had finally gotten the stove into functional condition in late August, a project that had involved 3 trips to the hardware supplier in Carver's Crossing, and one on Yungen on Gideon studying the flue connection with the pained expression of a man looking at someone else's mistake, and by the end of the 3rd day. The shelves Mara had built along the back wall of the storeroom held 42 jars of preserved beans. 11 of preserved tomatoes, 9 of preserved apple from the first small yield the orchard had managed, and 6 of the soft cheese Tilda had taught her to make from the goat's milk. She stood in the storeroom doorway and looked at the shelves. Tilda came to stand beside her. "That'll carry you," Tilda said. "Most of the way," Mara said. "I'll need to buy grain in January. You'll have money from the horses by January." This was true. The farrier work had picked up steadily through the fall, partly because the forge was now properly equipped, and she could handle complex shoeing jobs that she'd been referring out in the spring. Most of its windows were dark, partly because word had traveled further than Briar Hollow into the wider valley, and partly because fall was when horses needed attention before winter, when their owners were thinking ahead about which animals would need special care through the cold months. She'd shod 14 horses in September alone, which was more work than she'd expected and more money than she'd been counting on. She was also increasingly being brought horses that other people had given up on. The first one had been Hennessy's young sorrel, an animal that had developed such a strong aversion to being handled at the feet that the blacksmith in town had refused to take the job after 2 attempts. Hennessy's had brought him to Mara with the apologetic air of a man who expected to be told there was nothing to be done. She'd spent an entire afternoon with that horse before she touched a single hoof, just being in the space with him, moving around him without agenda, without the focused attention that horses read as predatory, doing small tasks near him, sweeping the forge floor, organizing tools until his neck dropped and his breathing slowed and he stopped tracking her with the white-rimmed eye of an animal waiting for something bad to happen. Then she'd asked for a foot. He'd given it. Not easily, he'd pulled back twice, and the second time his shoulder had caught her across the upper arm hard enough to leave a bruise she'd had for 2 weeks, but he'd given it, and she'd held it for 30 seconds and put it down gently and moved away and let him think about that. The next day she'd done it again. The day after that, the full trim. Hennessy had stood at the forge entrance watching and had not said a single word for the entire process, which was unusual for him. When it was done, he'd paid her without haggling and led the horse away. And 2 weeks later, he'd sent his neighbor to her with a similar problem and a note that said simply, "She knows what she's doing." That note had traveled. Notes in small valleys did. By October, she was seeing problem horses regularly, animals that had been mishandled or underhandled, or that had developed specific fears around foot care that made them dangerous to work with. She didn't take everyone. She turned down a horse from a farmer east of Wayfield Road, who she could see after 10 minutes was not fearful but dominant in a way that required different handling than she felt competent to provide yet. She said so honestly, and told him who to take the animal to, and he left slightly irritated, which she accepted as the cost of not lying about her limits. The ones she took, she worked carefully and slowly, and with the patience that her father had told her was not a virtue so much as a practical requirement. You could not rush a frightened animal into cooperation. You could only create the conditions where cooperation became possible, and then wait for the animal to choose it. She wrote this in her notebook. She crossed out the last phrase and rewrote it twice before she was satisfied with it. Gideon appeared on a Wednesday in mid-October with no announcement, which was his standard method of appearing anywhere, and stood in the forge, watching her work. A difficult gray mare with a proprietary silence that she'd come to understand was not judgment, but a particular form of attention that he extended only to work he considered worth watching. He stayed for 20 minutes. When she finished the trim and the mare walked out of the forge with the loose, easy movement of an animal whose feet finally felt right under her, he uncrossed his arms. "My nephew has a horse," he said. She looked at him. "The horse is fine," he said, which she understood immediately to mean the horse was not fine. "He just needs someone to look at the feet before winter." "Send him by," she said. The nephew arrived the following Monday with a bay gelding, whose feet had been neglected to a degree that made Mara press her lips together and say nothing for a moment while she walked slowly around the animal, looking. The hoof walls were long and flared, the toes run forward in a way that was changing the angle of the pastern, and one foot had a crack running from the ground surface, most of the way to the coronary band, to have developed secondary issues she'd need to address carefully. The nephew was a young man of perhaps 22, with the defensive look of someone who knew they were about to be told something they didn't want to hear. How long since he was shod, she said. Maybe 8 months, the nephew said. I've been meaning to. It's all right, she said, which it wasn't, exactly. But the horse was in front of her now, and there was no use dwelling on the past 8 months. It's fixable. But the cracked hoof is going to take time. I can address the acute angle today and pack the crack and set a shoe that'll support the wall while it grows out. But you'll need to bring him back in 6 weeks, and then again 6 weeks after that. The nephew looked at the horse and then at Mara with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. What does that cost? She told him. It was fair. He winced slightly, which she recognized as a person absorbing the cost of not dealing with something earlier when it would have been cheaper. All right, he said. She spent 3 hours on that horse. The crack was worse than it looked from the outside they usually were, and packing it correctly, so it would stay clean and grow out without opening further required a precision that was not compatible with being rushed. She wasn't. She learned in the spring that the work took the time it took, and adding urgency to a problem that required patience was how you turned a manageable problem into a serious one. When she was done, the horse walked differently. Not dramatically, the angle wouldn't correct, fully for several months, but noticeably, the hesitation in his gait reduced, his weight shifting more evenly across all 4 feet. The nephew felt it immediately when he took the lead rope. He's different, he said. He will be, she said. 6 weeks. The nephew came back in 6 weeks, and then 6 weeks after that, and both times the crack had grown, and the foot was better, and by the 3rd visit he was talking to her about other things, his own farm, a fencing problem he was having, whether she thought the winter would be hard. Not the careful, transactional conversation of a customer, but the easier talk of someone who had decided they were dealing with someone they trusted. She noticed this pattern. She noticed it and said nothing about it because she'd learned that naming things in process sometimes stopped the process. The bee harvest with Vera Osgood happened on a clear afternoon in late September and was as educational as Vera had promised, and considerably more chaotic than she'd made it sound. Vera wore a veil and moved through her 15 hives with the calm certainty of someone for whom the bees were simply present, neither threatening nor benign, just a fact of the work. Mara wore a veil too and moved considerably less calmly, which the bees responded to in the way bees always responded to uncertainty, which was with increased interest. He stung 4 times. She harvested honey anyway. Vera talked through everything she did as she did it, not a lecture, just narration. The way a person thinks out loud when they've done something so many times that doing it and explaining it had merged into one action. Mara listened with the intensity she brought to all instruction she considered valuable, which meant she was storing not just the words but the reasoning behind them, the why beneath the what. Your wall colonies, Vera said at some point. You leave them until they've got the colony size down in winter. Then you take the wall apart section by section, carefully, and you transfer the combs into new boxes. You lose some. That's just what happens. The colony will rebuild if the queen survives the move. How do I know if the queen survives? They'll tell you, Vera said. In a week you'll know. She moved the wall colonies in November, on a cold, clear day when the colony was at its smallest and slowest. She took the stone wall apart section by section with Vera's instructions in her head and her hands moving as carefully as she knew how to make them move. She found both queens. She found them because Vera had taught her what to look for, the elongated abdomen, the way the other bees oriented toward her rather than away. She transferred both colonies into boxes she'd built herself from Gideon's lumber, following the dimensions Vera had specified. She lost 1 comb in the transfer, dropped it badly, and had to abandon it. She said something short and emphatic that she would not have said with company present. She got both queens into their new boxes alive. She knew within a week, as Vera had said. She wrote 4 pages in the notebook about the transfer, what had worked, what hadn't, what she'd do differently next time, questions for Vera in the spring. Her father's notebook entries and hers were beginning to blur together. At this point, the handwriting similar because she'd learned to write from him, the thinking similar because she'd learned to think from him too, though she was making it into something of her own now, shaped by the specific problems of this specific land. The letter from her mother arrived in November. She found it at the post office in Briar Hollow, On a Thursday morning, when she was in town for supplies, a small envelope, the handwriting on the outside familiar in the way of things you haven't seen in a long time, but your body remembers, before your mind catches up. She stood at the post office counter and looked at it for a moment without opening it. She put it in her coat pocket. She bought her supplies. She drove back to Ashwick on the wagon she'd been able to purchase. In October, a small second-hand flatbed that she'd acquired from a farmer retiring his operation, paid for from the farrier income, which had given her a transportation independence she hadn't had since spring. She unloaded the supplies. She fed the goats. She made coffee. She sat at the table in the great room with the coffee and the unopened letter and looked at them both for a while. Then she opened it. It was not a long letter. Her mother was not a woman who wrote. At length she's communicated more through what she did or didn't do than through words, which was, Mara had come to understand, both her nature and a choice she'd made so many times it had become indistinguishable from her nature. The letter said that she hoped Mara was well. It said that she had heard through whom it didn't say. Though Mara suspected a chain of communication, she couldn't fully trace that Mara had settled somewhere and was doing all right. It said that her mother had been thinking about her. It said in two careful, constructed sentences near the end that were clearly the reason the letter existed at all, that she would like to visit, if that was something Mara wanted. If that was something Mara wanted. She read those words twice. She put the letter on the table and picked up her coffee and looked at the fire. She thought about the kitchen in Harold Briggs's house. She thought about the quality of the silence when she'd stood there with her canvas pack and her $2 silver, and the cold morning coming through the window. She thought about her mother's hands on the sink, white-knuckled, chosen, deliberate in their stillness. She thought about a lot of things over the next several days. She did not think about them exclusively, or with great drama the farm continued to require attention. The horses continued to come. Tilda came on Wednesday, and they talked about other things. But the letter sat on the table in the great room, and she was aware of it in the way you're aware of something you haven't decided about yet. What she felt was not simple enough to be called anger. Anger had been there in the beginning on the road, those first 2 days, in the cold nights on the floor of the ruined house, in the particular loneliness of the first weeks when she'd been surviving on cold determination and very little else. That anger had done work for her. It had kept her moving when moving was difficult. She didn't have contempt for it, but it had also softened over the months, not because she'd resolved anything, but because she'd been too busy to feed it, and things you don't feed lose some of their force. She was not ready to forget. She was not certain. She believed in the kind of forgetting that people sometimes implied was necessary for moving forward. Her father had told her once that some things didn't want to be forgotten, and the better question was what you decided to do alongside the memory, rather than whether you could eliminate it. She was thinking about the door. Her whole life, doors had been other people's decisions. Harold's door that he'd pointed at. Her mother's door, which her mother had let someone else control. The land office door, which the clerk had opened with the expression of a man who expected she'd be back through it before the ink dried. The forge door, which she'd walked through for the first time carrying nothing but a rusted hatchet and $2 silver worth of intent. This was her door now. She had built the porch it stood on with salvaged lumber. She had repaired the hinges herself. She had painted it last month with a red oxide paint she'd purchased at the hardware supplier because she'd wanted one visible, intentional thing about this house that said someone had made a choice here. She could open it. She could also choose who walked through it, and on what terms. On a Saturday morning, 9 days after the letter arrived, she sat at the table and wrote a reply. It was not a forgiving letter, and it was not a cold one. She had tried to write it as honestly as she could, which meant accepting that the truth of the situation was multiple things at once. She told her mother that she was welcome to come. She told her what Ashwick was not a comfortable place in the conventional sense, not a place with guest quarters or an extra bedroom yet, though she was working on the second room. She told her mother she would need to help with the work while she was there, because the farm ran on work and she couldn't suspend that for a visit of any length. And she said, in the last paragraph, in plain language that she'd written and crossed out and rewritten until it said exactly what she meant and nothing more, that she had made a life here and that a visit was a visit, which meant her mother was coming as a guest to Mara's home, not the other way around. She did not explain what she meant by that. She thought her mother would understand. She sealed the letter and took it to the post office and sent it. She walked back to Ashwick, feeling lighter than she'd expected and heavier than she'd hoped, which was about right. Winter settled into the valley in December with the serious, committed cold of high country winter that didn't posture or threaten, but simply arrived and installed itself and expected to be dealt with. Mara had prepared for it, as well as she knew how the woodpile was stacked chest-high along the north wall of the barn. The goats had a dry stall bedded with straw. The bee boxes were wrapped in burlap and positioned against the south-facing wall where they'd get the most midwinter sun. The storeroom shelves held everything she'd put up in fall. She was inside more than she'd been used to, which was its own adjustment. The farm work didn't stop, but it compressed the horses still needed attention. The forge still ran on days she had scheduled work. The animals needed feeding and watering in the cold, but the long outdoor days of spring and summer and fall had contracted into something shorter and more interior. She read. She'd bought 3 books from the general store, a volume on fruit tree management that she'd been looking for since the spring, a practical guide to livestock health that Tilda had mentioned, and a collection of essays on farming practice that she'd picked up on impulse and was reading slowly, arguing with it in the margins, in a way she suspected her father would have recognized. She also worked on the second room. The room she'd been sleeping in was the smallest of the 4 intact rooms she'd chosen it originally because it was easiest to heat, and she'd been meaning since summer to properly rehabilitate the second room for an eventual guest use. She'd repaired the walls and floor over the fall, patching plaster, relaying 2 cracked stones in the floor, replacing a section of baseboard that had rotted beyond saving. The window was already glazed. What it needed now was a proper bed frame. The one she'd been sleeping on herself was a functional construction of salvaged lumber that was comfortable enough for someone who'd been sleeping on a stone floor the previous spring, but would not qualify as hospitable by any reasonable standard. She built the bed frame herself. She built the bed 3 weekends and 2 consultations with Gideon, who came by once when she was fitting the joints and stood watching for a few minutes before saying, without being asked, "The mortise on the headboard rail wants to be deeper. If it's not, it'll work loose in 2 years." She cut it deeper. The completed bed frame was not a beautiful piece of furniture. It was solid and level and correctly jointed, and the proportions were right, and it would last. She put it in the second room and stood back and looked at it. It looked like a room where someone could stay. She thought about her mother sleeping in that room, looking at the walls Mara had plastered, and the floor Mara had repaired, and the window that let in the gray winter light over the orchard. She thought about what her mother would see, not just the room, but the whole of Ashwick, the forge and the barn and the drainage channel and the pruned orchard and the shelves full of put-up food and the horses that came and went from the yard. She thought about what it would mean for her mother to see all of that. She was not sure whether it would mean anything to her mother at all. She was honest enough with herself to hold that uncertainty without resolving it in advance. She went to check the bees. This had become a habit through the winter, not every day, but every few days, in the late morning when the temperature was at its daily high. She didn't open the boxes. She just stood near them and listened. And occasionally, on the warmer days, she'd see a few bees venturing out for a cleansing flight, the brief excursions that healthy colonies made even in winter to keep the hive clean. The sight of them still gave her a particular satisfaction of maintaining themselves through the cold season, doing what they were built to do. Though Vera had told her in the fall that the sign of a poorly wintered colony was silence. Complete silence, no sound at all through the box wall, nothing. A healthy colony made a low, sustained hum that you could hear if you pressed your ear against the wood, the collective warmth of thousands of bees clustered together, keeping each other alive. She pressed her ear to the box on a Tuesday in January. The hum was there. Both boxes. She stood upright in the cold morning and looked at the orchard, the bare branches of the pruned trees, the soft gray-brown of dormant wood, the stone wall where the bees had lived before she moved them, now just a stone wall again, with the gaps mortared closed, the history of it invisible, unless you knew to look. She knew to look. Gideon came by in January with a wagon load of lumber that she hadn't ordered. She came out of the forge when she heard him in the yard and stood at the door, looking at the wagon. "What's this?" she said. "Sycamore," he said, not getting down from the wagon seat immediately. "Mill's clearing a downed tree and the lumber's going cheap. Sycamore works well for flooring and it's durable." "I didn't order flooring." "No," he agreed. She looked at the lumber. It was good stock, well cut, tight grain, already drying. "What's the price?" she said. He told her. It was considerably below what the lumber would have cost at the supplier. She looked at him. "Lenora Ashwick," he said, in the tone of a man who had decided this settled the matter. She understood. He was not going to elaborate, and she was not going to ask him to, because some things were said simply, so both parties knew they understood each other, not because they required explanation. "Help me unload it," she said. He climbed down from the wagon. They stacked the lumber in the barn to continue drying, working without much conversation, the way they'd worked together on the roof. In the spring, a practical, comfortable silence, with the occasional necessary exchange. She noticed that Gideon moved differently in January than he had in the spring, slightly stiff in the cold, favoring his right side in a way he hadn't before. She didn't mention it. He didn't mention it. When the wagon was unloaded, she brought out coffee. They stood in the barn doorway with it, looking at the stack of sycamore lumber and the cold yard beyond, and the dormant orchard and the smoke coming from the chimney of the house that had stood cold for 11 years before she walked into it. "What? When did you last work with Lenora?" Mara said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The winter before she died," he said. "She needed the cellar entrance rebuilt. The stone had heaved. I came for a week." He looked at his coffee. She was an old woman by then. Sharp. She knew what she wanted, and she didn't waste time explaining herself. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Marissa said. "She was," he said. He drank the coffee. He handed her the cup back. "So do you," he said, without any particular emphasis, and went to his wagon and drove away. She stood in the barn doorway after he left, holding both cups. She was not sure whether she was surprised. She thought about it. No, she wasn't surprised. Gideon Rusk said things he meant, and didn't say things he didn't mean, which was a quality she'd recognized and respected in the first conversation they'd had. He had been observing her for months. His conclusions seemed reasonable to her. She went back into the forge. The winter work was quieter and more internal than the summer had been, but it was not idle. She spent the slow mornings on the sycamore flooring learning, again as she went, because she had never laid ardvad, and the process involved subtleties that only reveals themselves when you were already committed and past the point of stopping. She made mistakes. She had to take up 2 sections she'd laid incorrectly because the expansion gap was wrong and would have buckled in the spring when the wood moved. She relayed them. She developed opinions about flooring installation that she added to the notebook in the margins of the drainage channel notes. Because that was how the notebook worked, every page had become a palimpsest of multiple projects and multiple seasons, the writing layered over itself in a way that only she could navigate. February brought a thaw, and then a hard freeze, and then another thaw, the valley making up its mind. She lost 1 beehive. She found it on a Wednesday morning, the silence Vera had described. Absolute and final. Nothing when she pressed her ear to the box. She opened it carefully. The colony had not starved. The honey stores were still there. The cluster had shifted wrong sometime in January, moved away from their food stores during a cold snap, and starved within reach of what would have kept them alive, which was a thing bees sometimes did, that Vera had warned her about, and she hadn't been able to prevent. She stood in the cold with the silent box and felt the specific grief of losing something you'd worked to save. Then she closed the box and went to write Vera a letter about it, because Vera had told her to report what happened regardless, and because writing it down would help her understand what to watch for next winter. The surviving colony was strong. She pressed her ear to the second box, and the hum was there, lower than it had been in December, but steady, alive, the whole colony still working. She stood with her ear against the wood for a long time, longer than she needed to, just listening. Spring was coming. She could feel it the way her father had taught her, to feel it not in the weather, which was still winter, but in the quality of the light, the angle of it in the late afternoon, the specific smell of the soil on the days when the temperature climbed above freezing and the ground breathed. The orchard would bloom. The fields would want turning. The horses would come back, steadily, once the winter work was done, and farmers were thinking about the season ahead. She would need to order seed. She'd been planning the rotation differently this year, the knowledge she'd gained from the first year informing what she'd do in the second. The Southfield's drainage, giving her options she hadn't had before. She'd written the rotation out in the notebook 3 times, each version refined from the last. Her mother had not replied to her letter yet. She'd had time to make peace with the uncertainty of that, whether she'd come, whether she wouldn't, whether the reply would say something she was ready to receive or something she wasn't. She'd had enough months of managing problems that didn't have clean answers to understand that some things had to be held open-ended for a while and forcing a resolution before it was ready produced worse results than waiting. She could wait. The farm had taught her that. Not patience as a virtue someone possessed naturally, but patience as a skill you developed through years of working on things that operated on their own schedule regardless of yours. Orchards, soil, fearful animals, bee colonies, cracked hooves growing out, drainage channels, waiting for the rain to prove them. She went inside and built up the fire and opened the notebook to a fresh page and began writing out the spring planting plan, the clean lines of it, spreading across the paper, in her father's hand and her own, indistinguishable now, the knowledge passing forward. Outside, Ashwick waited for what was coming next, the way land always waited with no particular concern for whether the person tending it was ready, but with every advantage going to the person who was. Her mother's reply came in March, 2 weeks into the second spring. Mara found it at the post office on the same Thursday she went in for supplies. The same routine she'd been running for a year now. The same road, the same wagon, the same particular quality of early March light that was not yet warm but had stopped being purely cold. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she'd fully processed, seeing it, the way the body sometimes understands things a half second before the mind catches up. She put it in her coat pocket. She bought her supplies. She drove back to Ashwick. She unloaded the wagon, fed the goats, checked the surviving bee colony. The hum was there. Stronger now, the colony beginning to expand as the days lengthened, and then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the table and opened the letter. Her mother was coming in April. She would come by coach to Carver's Crossing and then hire someone to bring her the remaining distance to Briar Hollow. She would stay 2 weeks if that was acceptable. She said in a sentence near the middle of the letter that was written and then partially crossed out, Avon, and written again in slightly different words, that she understood what Mara had meant about coming as a guest, and that she accepted those terms. That sentence, the crossed-out version still visible beneath the rewritten one, the evidence of her mother sitting somewhere trying to find the right words, and not quite getting there on the first attempt, did something's unexpected to Mara. Not forgiveness exactly, not warmth, not yet, but a recognition. Her mother was a person who struggled with things. That had always been true, and Mara had always known it. But she had spent so long focusing on what her mother had failed to do that she'd stopped holding simultaneously the fact of who her mother actually was, a person with a limited capacity for conflict, shaped by decades of choosing the easier thing, now sitting somewhere trying to write a letter that required her to choose the harder one. The crossed-out sentence meant she'd tried at least twice. Marcia put the letter in the notebook, between the page with Lenora's letter and the page where she'd started the spring planting plan. She finished her coffee. She went back outside to start turning the south field. Spring was more work than the first spring had been because she knew more and therefore expected more of herself and the land. The south field turned better. The drainage channel had done its work. Through the winter, the soil was looser, less compacted, more responsive to the spade. She was rotating this year. Corn moving to the north field, beans and squash staying south. A small section of the middle ground she was trying in oats for the first time on Tilda's suggestion, which Tilda had framed as practical advice and which Mara suspected also contained an element of wanting to see whether she'd do it. She did it. The oats went in crooked in 2 rows and straight in the rest, which was an improvement over last year's corn, and she noted the improvement in the notebook with the dry satisfaction of someone who had expected to get marginally better at something and had in fact gotten marginally better at it. The orchard bloomed in late April. She had been watching for it, checking the buds through March and early April, watching them swells and break and show color, the process slower than she wanted it to be, the way all important things moved slower when you were paying close attention. And then one morning, she came out of the house in the early light, and the orchard was white. Not every tree. 3 of the trees Tilda had flagged as questionable had not bloomed. 2 of them were not going to recover, and she'd already accepted this. The 3rd had put out leaves without flowers, which meant it was alive, but redirecting its energy, which might resolve itself and might not. But the rest of the orchard, 9 pear trees and 7 apple trees, the ones that had responded to the pruning by remembering what they were supposed to do, were in full bloom, the white flowers covering the branches so densely that from the house the orchard looked like something a person might have imagined rather than grown. Mara stood at the gate of the orchard for a long time. She was not a sentimental person by nature. She'd been too busy surviving to develop much sentimentality, and before that she'd been too busy defending herself against other people's assessments of her to have much energy left for it. But she stood at that gate and looked at what the orchard had become after 1 winter's pruning and 1 year of being tended. And she felt something that she did not try to name, because naming it would have required her to admit how much it cost her, in the first year, not to know whether any of this was going to work. She had not known. She'd made her decisions based on her best understanding of the problem and the available information. And then she'd executed them as carefully as she could and waited to find out if she was right. Most of its windows were dark, and there had been mornings in the first winter when she'd lain in her bedroll before dawn listening to the cold house and known, with the specific clarity that comes at 4 in the morning, that she might be wrong about all of it. The orchard said she hadn't been wrong about this part. The bees found the blossoms within 2 days of the bloom opening. She watched them working the flowers one afternoon, standing at the orchard's edge with her arms crossed and the particular warmth of early spring on her face, and thought about Lenora writing the letter in the cavity beneath the hearth in October 1000, 860, telling whoever found it about the bees and the orchard and the south field drainage, leaving instructions for a future she couldn't see. She thought about what it meant to leave something behind, that you wouldn't be present for the trust required, the willingness to act without knowing the outcome. Her mother arrived on the 14th of April. The coach from Carver's Crossing dropped her at the Briar Hollow post office, where Mara was waiting with the wagon. She had not thought carefully about what she expected to feel when she saw her mother step down from the coach, which was an oversight, because what she felt was complicated and immediate and not entirely manageable. Her mother was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps not smaller, perhaps Mara had simply grown into a person who stood differently in the world than she had 2 years ago, and the comparison had shifted. Her mother was 51 years old and looked also like a woman who had made a journey she wasn't certain was a good idea and was determined not to show the uncertainty. They looked at each other. "Mara," her mother said. "There's room in the wagon for your bag," Mara said. It was not a warm greeting. It was also not a cold one. The dark, it was the greeting of a person who was not yet ready to be warm but was committed to being present, which was the most honest thing she had to offer at that particular moment. And she had decided in the weeks before her mother's arrival that honesty was going to be the condition of this visit, even when it was uncomfortable. Her mother put her bag in the wagon and climbed up to the seat. They drove the 1.5 miles to Ashwick without much conversation. The road, the valley, the early spring green of the fields on either side. Her mother looked at things without commenting. Mara drove without explaining. When they came through the gate and up the track, and the house came into view, the red-painted door, visible from the track, smoke from the chimney, the goats in the paddock, the sound of a horse somewhere in the forge yard, her mother was quiet for a long moment. "You did this," her mother said. "With help," Marissa said, "but mostly yes." They got down from the wagon. Mara showed her mother the house, not a formal tour, not a presentation, but the practical walkthrough of a person showing someone where things were so they could function. The kitchen, the storeroom, the second room with the bed frame Mara had built. Her mother ran her hand along the bed frame without speaking. She looked at the window, the plastered walls, the floor. "I built the frame," Mara said. "The floor is sycamore. Gideon got me the lumber at cost." "Who is Gideon?" "A carpenter who helped with the roof. He knew Lenora Ashwick." Her mother looked at the room for another moment. "It's a good room," she said. That was the beginning. The first 3 days were careful. Her mother helped with the morning animal chores without being asked. She'd grown up on a farm, a fact Mara had known intellectually but had never connected to anything practical until she watched her mother move around the goat paddock with the ease of someone who understood animals and was not afraid of them. They worked alongside each other in the mornings and talked about practical things, what the goats needed, what the garden wanted, how the forge ran, and in the evenings they sat by the fire in the great room and talked about less practical things, slowly, like people testing ice before committing their full weight. Her mother asked about the first winter. Mara told her not everything, not the 4 in the morning certainty of possible failure, but the shape of it, the cold floor, the rusted hatchet, the watercress, Galt and his gray gelding, the hearthstone, and what was under it. Her mother listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Mara finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. "You had the gold the whole time," she said. "Yes, and you didn't leave." No, her mother looked at the fire. "I would have left," she said, not self-pityingly, just as an honest assessment of herself. "I know," Mara said. It was not an accusation. It was just true, and they both knew it was true, and saying it plainly turned out to be less damaging than Mara had expected. The truth of her mother's limits had been in the room between them since the morning at the kitchen sink. Naming it, it turned out, made it take up less space, rather than more. "I was afraid," her mother said. That morning, "I was afraid of what he'd do if I argued." "I know that too," Mara said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Mara said. "It doesn't." Another silence. "I'm sorry," her mother said. 2 words. She said them without embellishment and without the defensive qualifications that apologies sometimes carried, the "but," the "you have to understand," the "I didn't mean to." Just the 2 words offered plainly. Mara looked at the fire. She had rehearsed this moment in her head approximately 0 times, because she'd learned from the farm that rehearsing things you couldn't control was a waste of the energy you'd need for when they actually happened. What she felt was not the clean release that apologies were sometimes supposed to produce. It was more complicated, a kind of partial settling, the way soil settled after heavy rain, compressed and denser, but not finished moving. "I hear you," she said, and she meant it. They didn't resolve everything in that conversation. Mara had not expected to and had not wanted to. Resolution of the kind her mother's visit had required was not a single event, but a process, and processes took the time they took, and she had learned that lesson thoroughly enough by now that she applied it here without much difficulty. What she noticed over the following days was that the visit was changing shape. Her mother was not the woman Mara had known under Harold Briggs's roof. Or perhaps she was, underneath. But here she had no Harold to manage and no household to maintain within his tolerances. And without those constraints, something else showed up, a competence Mara hadn't seen before, or hadn't had reason to look for. Her mother knew how to make things. She spent a morning repairing a piece of harness that had been sitting in the barn since fall, because Mara hadn't gotten around to it. She looked at the garden plan and made 2 suggestions about companion planting that Mara hadn't considered, and which, when she thought about them, made sense. She cooked 3 meals that were significantly better than anything Mara had been producing in the kitchen, and she did it without comment on the state of Mara's cooking, which was the sort of tact that Mara had not known her mother possessed and was unexpectedly grateful for. Tilda came on Wednesday. She came through the gate and found both women in the orchard, Mara explaining the pruning logic to her mother, who was listening with the intent focus of someone who had grown up around orchards and was comparing what she was hearing against what she already knew. Tilda introduced herself without ceremony, and within 10 minutes had decided that Mara's mother was worth talking to about dairying, and they talked about dairying for opal minutes, while Mara worked on the apple trees and listened, and occasionally added something, and mostly let the conversation run, without her. At dinner that evening, her mother said, "She's good people." "She is," Mara said. "She watches out for you." "She's been useful," Mara said, which was her version of agreeing. Her mother looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and something more serious. "You're allowed to say you have people who care about you, Mara. That's not weakness." Mara looked at her plate. "I know," she said. She did know. She was still learning to say it without the slight resistance that acknowledgement of need produced in her. The reflex she'd developed in the years of being underestimated, when need had felt like confirmation of someone else's low expectations. She was working on it. Working on it was different from having fixed it. Gideon stopped by on Thursday, which was not his usual day, and therefore suggested he'd come specifically rather than in passing. He came into the yard and nodded at Mara's mother with the neutral courtesy he extended to everyone and then looked at Mara. "Creek Road soft from the snowmelt," he said. "The low crossing near the Hennessy Road wants a look. I was going to check it Friday," she said. "Check it today," he said. "The temperature's dropping tonight." He drove away. Her mother watched him go. "He doesn't say much. He says exactly what he means," Mara said. "That's different." They checked the crossing that afternoon, Mara's mother sitting in the wagon, while Mara got down and walked the soft section of the road, prodding with a stick, assessing the depth of the soft ground, and where it was likely to freeze, and whether it would freeze in a way that would hold traffic or heave and crack and become worse. It was going to heave. She went back to town and told Jonas Creed, who handled the road maintenance for this section of the creek road, and Jonas nodded and said he'd get gravel on it before dark. Her mother said, "On the drive back to Ashwick, you know everyone here." "I've been working with them for a year," Mara said. "It's more than that," her mother said. "They know you." Mara was quiet for a moment. "I think they know what I can do," she said. "That's the same thing," her mother said. "When you're lucky." She was, Mara thought, not wrong about that. The kind of being known that lasted, that meant something, was usually the kind that came through demonstrated action rather than stated identity. People in Briar Hollow knew her because they'd seen her on the roof with Gideon, seen her in the orchard through the winter, seen her come through the creek road gate on hard mornings and go to work. They'd brought her their difficult horses and she'd handled them. They'd given her grain on credit and she'd paid it back. They'd helped dig a berm in the rain because she'd asked, and the orchard had survived. That accumulation that was the knowing. And it had taken a year to build and could not have been built faster, and could not have been the material it was made of required time to set. The 2 weeks passed in the way of time, spent in genuine work faster than it should have, with more in it than the length seemed able to hold. Her mother planted 3 rows of the kitchen garden with the particular efficiency of someone who had planted gardens for 30 years. She helped Mara rack the winter's small batch of apple cider vinegar, which had turned well and smelled right. She sat in the forge one morning watching Mara work, and didn't speak for an hour, jotched, and Mara was aware of being watched and did not perform for the watching, but simply worked the way she always worked. And at the end of the hour, her mother said, "Your father taught you that." "Yes," Mara said. "He'd have been pleased," her mother said. She said it quietly and did not elaborate, and Mara understood that the statement cost her something, carrying the weight of a person who had known Thomas Whitcombe as a husband and as a father and as someone who was gone, which was a different weight than the one Mara carried, and they were standing in it together now in the smoke and heat of the forge. "I think so too," Mara said. On the last evening, they sat together in the great room after dinner, the fire low, the notebook spread on the table. Mara had been reviewing her second-year planting notes, and her mother had been reading the ones with her father's handwriting, slowly, not commenting, just reading. Lenora's letter and the ivory brooch sat on the mantel beside the farrier rasp. Her mother looked at the mantel for a long time. "Tell me about her," she said. "Lenora." So Mara told her what she knew, which was pieced together from the letter, and Gideon's fragments and Jonas's recollection, and the evidence of the farm itself, the fireplace built to last, the orchard planted with intention, the hidden gold that was neither hoarding nor excess, but a family's honest savings placed into safekeeping against a time of need. A woman who had loved a place and what happened in it, and had tried, with the tools available to her, to ensure the place continued. "She sounds like someone who knew herself," her mother said. "I think she did," Mara said. "That's not nothing," her mother said. "Knowing what you are, and being it without apology. Most people spend their whole lives working up to it and don't quite get there." Mara looked at her mother. It was the most self-aware thing she had ever heard her mother say, and it landed in the room between them with the weight of something that had been true for a long time, and was only now being said out loud. She understood, looking at her mother's face in the firelight, the tiredness in it, the particular set of a woman who had been navigating around other people's needs and fears for so long that she wasn't always sure what was left underneath, that she was not looking at a villain. She was looking at a person who had made choices that had real consequences and who was now late trying to understand what those choices had cost. That was not a comfortable thing to sit with. It was also not the thing she'd expected to find. You're different, her mother said after a while. Then what? Then when you left. A pause. You were angry then. Underneath everything, you were just furious. Mara considered this. I probably was. You're not now. I don't have time to be, Mara said. And then, because she wanted to be honest, it's also that there's nothing to be angry at anymore. Exactly. The farm doesn't care whether I'm angry. The horses don't care. The bees definitely don't care. Her mother smiled a small, genuine smile, the kind that didn't seem to cost her anything, which was rarer than Mara had known to look for. The bees, she said. The bees, Mara agreed. Her mother left the next morning. Mara drove her to the Briar Hollow post office for the coach to Carver's Crossing. They stood beside the wagon in the early morning light, the kind of clear spring morning that meant the valley was fully committed to the season now. No more retreating back into winter. Her mother looked at her. Can I come again? She said. In the fall, maybe. Mara thought about the second room with the bed frame. Most of its windows were dark. She thought about her mother's hands on the harness she'd repaired, the rows of the kitchen garden she'd planted, the way she'd sat in the forge watching without trying to make the watching into something. Yes, Mara said. Her mother reached out and put her hand briefly on Mara's arm, not an embrace. They weren't there yet, but a contact, deliberate, chosen. Then she picked up her bag and got on the coach. Mara drove back to Ashwick alone. The valley was green around her. The fields, coming in on both sides of the creek road, the orchard visible full from the low section of the road, white going to green, now, as the bloom finished and the leaves pushed through. She pulled the wagon through the gate and up the track and tied the horse at the rail and stood in the yard for a moment looking at the house. The red door, the sound roof, the smoke from the chimney that had stood cold for 11 years. She went inside. The second year at Ashwick was different from the first. In the specific ways that second years always differed, more was known. Less was improvised from panic. The work had acquired a rhythm that the first year had not possessed, because rhythm required repetition, and she'd been doing everything for the first time. But different in another way, too, a quality she found difficult to name directly but recognized when she encountered it. She was not spending energy on proving things. The first year, she understood looking back, she'd been proving something with every decision she made. Not to Briar Hollow, exactly, she'd been largely indifferent to their opinion, in the sense that she'd kept working regardless of it, but to some internal audience she'd been carrying, since Harold Briggs pointed at the door. The version of herself that was always quietly arguing against the assessment that she was not enough. That argument had quieted, not because she'd won it. She'd done enough by now to know that the argument against your own worth was not something you won once and settled permanently. It came back in different forms in harder seasons. The February when the beehive went silent. The night in the first winter when she'd lain on the stone floor knowing she might be wrong about everything. She would have other nights like it, other seasons. But she'd also stopped measuring each day against that internal argument. The farm measured its own days in yield and rainfall and horsework and preserved food and healthy colonies and drainage channels that held. Those were the measures that mattered, and she'd learned to let them matter. Summer of the second year brought the horsework to a level she hadn't quite anticipated. The difficult horses had made her reputation in ways the routine work hadn't, because difficult things, when handled, will travel. By June, she had a waiting list, farmers from as far as Wayfield Road and beyond, bringing animals that other farriers had turned down or given up on, horses that had been managed around rather than through their problems, animals that had learned that causing enough trouble would eventually make this trouble stop. She had a waiting list, and she did not rush the list. She turned down a horse in July, a young stallion whose owner was impatient, and whose impatience Mara recognized would become the horse's problem the moment he took him home, making whatever she did here temporary at best. She explains this as plainly as she could, without being rude, which required some careful word selection, because what she actually believed was that the horse was fine, and the man was the problem. The man was not pleased. She refunded his deposit, and he left, and she went back to the horse she'd been working with before he arrived. Tilda witnessed this from the fence where she'd been watching and said, "When the man was gone, you just turned down good money." "I turned down a job I couldn't finish," Mara said. "That's different." Tilda looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it is." Gideon's nephew came back regularly now, not just for the Bay Gelding's ongoing foot care, though that continued, but for other questions. fencing, equipment, whether a piece of land he was considering buying had the drainage problems that Mara had managed to solve at Ashwick. He asked her things as though it had never occurred to him that she might not know, which was its own quiet form of respect. His name was Walt, she learned eventually. He was 23 and learning to run a farm of his own, and was approaching the learning with the focused seriousness of someone who understood he had things to figure out and was willing to admit it, which put him ahead of most people she'd dealt with. The south corner of the field I'm looking at pools after heavy rain, he told her one afternoon in August, standing at the fence of the Ashwick yard while she worked. The seller says it drains. It doesn't drain. Walk the property in wet weather before you buy it, she said. Don't take anyone's word for drainage. The seller won't allow viewing in wet weather. She looked up at him. That's your answer. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I suppose it is. She went back to work. After a moment, he said, more quietly, how did you know this place was worth it? When you bought it. She thought about this. Honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about most things lately without rounding the edges into something cleaner than the truth. I didn't, she said. I knew it was the only thing I could afford, and I knew the bones were sound, and I knew I had skills that could address most of what was wrong. That's not the same as knowing it was worth it. But it was worth it. It was, she said. But I found that out by doing it, not before. He nodded slowly. That's not a very reassuring answer, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. He bought a different piece of land 2 months later, one that drained correctly, that she'd walked with him in a light rain specifically to verify. He paid for the consultation in a side of smoked pork and 3 hours of fence mending, which was the going rate for that kind of afternoon in Redfern Valley. The second I thrived. By August, it had built itself back to the strength of a healthy established colony, and she took her first full honey harvest from it with Vera present, not because she needed supervision anymore, but because Vera had come to enjoy the visits, and Mara come to enjoy them too. The company of a person who had been doing something longer than she'd been alive and had strong opinions about it, and no particular need to convince anyone else of those opinions. You lost the one colony, Vera said during the harvest. You'll lose one again eventually. I know, Marissa said. Doesn't mean you did it wrong. Sometimes colonies go wrong for their own reasons. I know that too. Vera handed her a frame with the patient ease of someone who had been handling bees for 40 years. The ones you saved are the ones that matter. She thought about that statement for several days afterward. It applied to more than bees, obviously, and she suspected Vera knew that, though she also suspected Vera would deny having meant anything philosophical by it if directly asked. The ones you saved. She thought about the berm in the storm rain, the drainage channel, the 3-corner orchard trees that had survived the flood of standing water because she'd seen the slope from the forge yard and acted on what she saw. The bay gelding's cracked hoof, grown out now into a sound wall, the original crack visible only as a faint line near the ground surface that would be gone entirely by spring. She thought about her mother's crossed-out sentence in the letter, and the visit, and the sextant room with its sycamore floor. Some things you saved completely, some things you saved partially, and they kept going on their own. Some things you windows were dark, some things you couldn't save at all, and you had to write it down and learn what you could from it and try differently next time. That was the work. All of it. Not just the farm. Fall of the second year, she did something she'd been thinking about since spring. She asked Gideon whether his nephew, Cal the shorter of the 2 apprentices who'd worked on the roof, the one who'd handed her a nail without being asked, was still looking for work. Gideon said he was, that Cal had finished his apprenticeship and was doing day work, but didn't have a steady situation. Send him by, she said. Cal came by on a Monday and they talked for an hour. He was 20 now, serious in the way of young people who had decided to be competent rather than impressive. She told him she needed someone 2 or 3 days a week through the winter, and into planting season farm work for forge work, she'd teach him what she knew about both. She told him the rate, which was fair. She told him she expected him to ask questions when he didn't understand something, and to say so when he didn't know rather than guessing and making a problem worse. That's it, he said. That's it, she said. He started the following week. He was not naturally skilled with horses, but he was patient with them, which was the quality she valued over natural skill. Natural skill without patience produced impatient horsemen, and impatient horsemen produced horses with problems. She showed him what she knew. He learned at the rate of someone who was paying attention with a hurry to seem like he'd learned it already. He dropped a rasping file on the third day, and it bounced and cut her hand across the knuckle, not seriously, a surface, cut, but it bled enough to require a cloth wrapped around it for the afternoon. And he went white with the specific mortification of a young person who has made a mistake they can't immediately fix. "It's fine, he said. "It's fine," she said again. "Don't grip the handle so tight. That's why it slipped." He didn't grip too tight after that. The letter she'd been least expecting arrived in October. It came from the county, not the land office specifically, but the county's administrative office. A formal envelope with official-looking stamps that she opened with the particular wariness of someone who had learned that official correspondence sometimes contained problems you hadn't anticipated. She read it twice. It was a request. Not a demand, a request. The county was documenting productive small farms in the valley. As part of an agricultural survey, an Ashwick farm had been listed among the properties showing significant improvement over the previous 2 years. They were asking whether she'd be willing to speak with a county surveyor about her methods, particularly the drainage work. She put the letter on the table and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the morning she'd placed 2 silver dollars on the land office counter while the clerk looked at her coins with the expression of a man who expected to be proved right about something. She thought about the woman outside the feed merchant who'd said she wouldn't last a month. She wrote back and said she would be willing to speak with the surveyor. The surveyor came in November, a methodical man named Ehlers, who asked careful questions and took detailed notes and walked the drainage channel with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand how it worked. He asked about the berm. He asked about the orchard. He asked about the soil preparation methods she'd used in the south field. She answered everything, honestly, including the things she'd gotten wrong and had to redo because she'd found that describing mistakes was often more useful than describing successes, since mistakes contained information about the problem that success sometimes covered over. Ehlers wrote everything down. When he left, he said, "You've done considerable work here." 2 years of it, she said. "What made you stay?" he said. Not intrusively, just a question, genuinely curious. The question of a man who'd spent the morning looking at what the work had produced and wanted to understand the person who'd done it. She thought about how to answer him honestly. "I had skills that fit the problem," she said. And the problem was specific. 40 acres, stone house, neglected orchard. I could see what was wrong. I can't always see that, but here I could. "That sounds like it made the decision easy," Ehlers said. "It made it possible," she said. "Not easy." He nodded and wrote something in his notes and drove away. Her mother came in November as she'd said she would. She came for 10 days this time, and the visit had the ease that second visits sometimes have the exploratory caution of the first one resolved into something more settled, not comfortable, exactly. Not that uncomplicated, but honest in a way that was its own kind of comfort. They still had conversations that were difficult. Her mother said something on the 4th day about Harold Briggs not defending him, but not quite not defending him, a hedging statement that Mara received and did not let pass without responding to. And there was a sharp 30 minutes in the kitchen that was not pleasant for either of them. But they got through it. They kept going after it, which was the thing Mara had not been sure her mother was capable of, the capacity to have the sharp exchange and not retreat from it, not close up, not end the conversation and let it sit unresolved until the next visit when it would be bigger. Her mother stayed in the kitchen. They finished making dinner. They ate. That, Mara thought afterward, was more than she'd had reason to expect. On the last evening, Mara showed her mother the hearthstone. She hadn't planned to. She'd been planning to keep it not secret, not exactly, but private. The way some things were private, not because they needed hiding, but because they belonged to the interior of something rather than its surface. But her mother was sitting in the great room looking at the mantel, at the ivory brooch and the farrier rasp and the notebook lying open, and she asked about the brooch, and Mara told her about Lenora. The whole story this time, and then somehow it seemed incomplete without the rest of it. She lifted the hearthstone. Her mother leaned forward and looked at the cavity. "Empty now," Mara said. "I spent the gold on the roof and the seed and the forge tools and the livestock and most of the other things you can see when you walk around. What did you keep?" Mara replaced the stone. Enough for emergencies, she said, and her letter, and the brooch. Her mother was quiet for a moment. She didn't know who would find it. No. She just left it there. She left what she could, Mara said, for whoever came next. Her mother looked at the mantle for a long time. You're what came next, she said finally. Yes, Mara said. There were things she could have said about what that meant about the $2 silver, and the walk west and the cold floor, and all the mornings she'd gotten up and worked when working was the only available option. There were things she could have said about what it meant to be thrown out with nothing and end up with something that was entirely your own, built from knowledge rather than inheritance, earned rather than given. She didn't say them. She didn't need to. The farm said them. The sound roof and the red door and the sycamore floors and the orchard visible through the window in the lamplight and the low hum of a healthy colony that would survive another winter. All of it said everything she might have. Wanted to say more clearly than she said it. She banked the fire for the night. Lenora's brooch sat on the mantel, the small carved bird with its wings spread, looking forward or looking back, still impossible to say, still not needing to be settled. Her father's rasp beside it. The notebook opened to the spring planning plan, 2 years of notes pressed into its pages in two people's handwriting, now becoming one voice. And outside Ashwick Farm in the November dark, the cold orchard, the sound barn, the forge with its banked fire, the drainage channel running clean through the south field, the stone wall where the bees had lived before she moved them, the road into Briar Hollow that she'd walked for the first time on blistered feet, with $2 silver and a canvas pack, and absolutely nowhere else to go. She had gone somewhere. She had built it herself. Not without help, she was clear-eyed enough to know that now, to know that the help of Tilda and Gideon and Jonas and Galt and Vera and all the rest of them had been part of what made this possible, and that pretending otherwise would be the vanity of someone who needed the story to be simpler than it was. You did not build a life alone. You brought what you had, and you found people who would work alongside you if you treated them honestly, and the combination was what grew. But she had known what she brought. She had never stopped knowing it, even in the winters, even in the 4 a.m. certainties of possible failure. Her father had put that knowledge into her hands and her head over 13 years of patient teaching, and she had carried it 40 miles on blistered feet to a ruined farm on a creek road in Redfern Valley and used every bit of it. The world had told her she was too much in the wrong ways and not enough in the right ones. It had been wrong. Not because she'd proved it wrong. By becoming something other than herself, she was still broad and strong-handed and direct and imperfect and sometimes difficult, still the person who ate when she was hungry and worked when the work required it, and said plainly what she thought without particularly ornamenting it. She had not become smaller to fit a shape the world found easier. She had simply continued to be exactly what she was, in a place that had finally given her enough room to do it, in a place that she had chosen and paid for and repaired and planted and tended until it held her the way a place should hold a person completely, without condition, with room enough for all of it. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything.